At the end of his life, Moses stood on a mountain and looked across a river at the land he had spent 40 years trying to reach. He could see it. He could name its regions, but he would not cross into it. Behind him lay Egypt, a sea divided, a mountain wrapped in fire, and a wilderness filled with graves. Below him waited a nation that had known him as liberator, lawgiver, judge, and intercessor. Yet the man who had brought them to the boundary would go no farther. To understand how Moses reached that mountain, we have to return to a river, a royal death sentence, and a mother trying to keep her child alive. The family of Israel had entered Egypt generations earlier, when Joseph held power beside Pharaoh and used that position to preserve his relatives during a famine. They arrived as a large household. In time, Joseph died. His brothers died. That entire generation passed away. But their descendants multiplied. The Israelites became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king arose over Egypt, one who did not recognize what Joseph had done. He saw this growing people not as the family of a former benefactor, but as a threat inside his borders. He told his people that the Israelites had become too many and too strong. If war came, he warned, they might join Egypt's enemies, fight against the kingdom, and escape from the land. His answer was calculated oppression. Taskmasters were placed over the Israelites, and forced labor was used to break them down. They built the storage cities of Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh. But the more the Egyptians afflicted them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. Fear hardened into cruelty. The Egyptians made their lives bitter with bricks, mortar, fieldwork, and every form of harsh labor. Pharaoh then moved from exploitation to organized killing. He summoned 2 Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and ordered them to watch the Hebrew women as they gave birth. If the child was a daughter, she could live. If the child was a son, they were to kill him. The midwives did not obey. They feared God and allowed the boys to live. When Pharaoh demanded an explanation, they told him the Hebrew women gave birth before a midwife could arrive. Their resistance preserved lives, and their own households were established. Israel continued to increase. Pharaoh responded by making the murder public policy. Every son born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile. Daughters were permitted to live. It was under this decree that a man and woman from the tribe of Levi had a son. His mother saw that he was a remarkable child, and she hid him for 3 months. When she could conceal him no longer, she made a small vessel from papyrus reeds, coated it with bitumen and pitch, placed the child inside, and set it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. The river chosen as the instrument of death now carried a hidden life. The boy's sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. Soon, Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river. Her attendants walked along the bank, and she noticed the basket among the reeds. She sent a servant to retrieve it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying. She recognized him as one of the Hebrew children, and she had compassion on him. At that moment, the boy's sister stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew woman who could nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. The girl went and brought the child's own mother. The princess told the woman to take the boy and nurse him, promising to pay her. So his mother received back the son she had surrendered to the river, and for a time she raised him under the protection of Pharaoh's own household. When the boy grew older, his mother brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. The princess named him Moses, connecting his name with the fact that she had drawn him out of the water. An Israelite child condemned by Pharaoh had survived through the defiance of women, midwives who refused to kill, a mother who refused to surrender hope, a sister who watched, and an Egyptian princess who chose compassion. Moses grew up inside the house of the ruler whose decree had threatened his life. Years passed. When Moses had grown, he went out to his own people and saw their forced labor. He watched an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his fellow Israelites. Moses looked in every direction. Seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid the body in the sand. The next day he went out again and found two Hebrew men fighting. He challenged the man who was in the wrong and asked why he was striking his companion. The man answered with a question that would follow Moses for much of his life. "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" Then he asked whether Moses intended to kill him as he had killed the Egyptian. Moses realized that his act was known. Pharaoh heard about it and tried to have Moses killed. The adopted son of the royal household was now a fugitive from the king. He fled Egypt and settled in the land of Midian. There, beside a well, Moses encountered the daughters of a priest of Midian. The 7 women had come to draw water and fill the troughs for their father's flock, but shepherds drove them away. Moses rose to help them and watered their animals. When the daughters returned home earlier than expected, their father, Reuel, asked how they had finished so quickly. They told him that an Egyptian had rescued them from the shepherds and had drawn water for the flock. Reuel asked why they had left the man behind. He told them to invite him to eat. Moses agreed to remain with the family, and Reuel gave him his daughter Zipporah as a wife. She bore a son, whom Moses named Gershom, because Moses had become a foreigner in a foreign land. In Egypt, he had been divided between the palace and an enslaved people. In Midian, even his son's name marked him as an outsider. During those years, the king of Egypt died, but the death of one Pharaoh did not end the oppression. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Their plea rose to God. God heard them. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He saw the Israelites, and he knew. Moses, meanwhile, was tending the flock of his father-in-law, now identified as Jethro. He led the flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. He turned aside to examine it. When God saw that Moses had turned, he called to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." Moses answered, "Here I am." He was told not to come closer. The ground beneath him was holy, and he was to remove his sandals. The voice identified itself as the God of his father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses covered his face. He was afraid to look at God. The Lord told him that he had seen the affliction of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cries under their taskmasters and knew their suffering. He had come down to deliver them from Egypt and bring them into a good and spacious land, a land occupied by other peoples, but promised to the descendants of Israel. Then came the command Moses did not expect. "I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." The fugitive was being sent back to the court that wanted him dead. The man whose authority had been rejected by another Hebrew was being commanded to lead the entire people out. Moses asked, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God did not answer by enlarging Moses' reputation. He answered with a promise, "I will be with you." The confirming sign would come after the deliverance. When Moses had brought the people out of Egypt, they would worship God on this very mountain. Moses then asked what he should say when the Israelites demanded the name of the God who had sent him. God answered, "I am who I am." Moses was to tell Israel, "I am has sent me to you." He was also to speak the covenant name of the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was the name by which he was to be remembered through the generations. Moses was instructed to gather Israel's elders and tell them that the God of their ancestors had appeared to him. God had seen what Egypt had done, and he had promised to bring them out of affliction into the land of Canaan. The elders would listen. Moses and the elders would then go to the king of Egypt and ask permission to travel into the wilderness to sacrifice to their God. But Pharaoh would not let them go unless compelled by a mighty hand. God would strike Egypt with wonders, and only then would the king release them. Israel would not leave empty-handed. The Egyptians would give them silver, gold, and clothing, and the people who had been enslaved would carry away Egypt's wealth. Still, Moses resisted. He said the Israelites would not believe him. They would deny that the Lord had appeared to him. God asked what he held in his hand. A staff, Moses answered. He was told to throw it on the ground. The staff became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. Then God commanded him to take it by the tail. When Moses seized it, it became a staff again. The sign was given so the people would believe that the God of their ancestors had appeared to him. For a second sign, Moses placed his hand inside his cloak. When he withdrew it, the skin was diseased and white. He returned it to his cloak, pulled it out again, and the hand was restored. If the people rejected both signs, Moses was to take water from the Nile and pour it onto dry ground. The water would become blood. Moses raised another objection. He was not an eloquent speaker, he said. He had never been one, and speaking with God had not changed that. He described himself as slow of speech and tongue. The Lord asked who had made the human mouth, who made a person unable to speak or hear, who gave sight or blindness. God told Moses to go, promising to be with his mouth and teach him what to say. At last, Moses stripped the objection down to a refusal. Please send someone else. The Lord's anger burned against him. Yet an answer was already on the way. Aaron, Moses' brother, could speak well, and he was coming to meet Moses. Moses would tell Aaron what to say. God would guide both of them, and Aaron would speak to the people for him. Moses was to take the staff with which he would perform the signs. Moses returned to Jethro and asked permission to go back to his relatives in Egypt and see whether they were still alive. Jethro sent him in peace. God told Moses that the men who had sought his life were dead. Moses placed his wife and sons on a donkey and began the journey back to Egypt, carrying the staff of God in his hand. Before he arrived, God told him that Pharaoh would resist. Moses was to perform the signs, but Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. He was to tell the king that Israel was God's firstborn son. If Pharaoh refused to release that son to worship, Pharaoh's own firstborn son would die. On the journey at a lodging place, the story suddenly turns severe and compressed. The Lord confronted Moses and sought to put him to death. Zipporah took a flint, circumcised her son, touched his feet with it, and called him a bridegroom of blood. Then the threat withdrew. The covenant sign Moses carried toward Israel had first entered his own household through blood. Elsewhere, God told Aaron to go into the wilderness to meet his brother. Aaron found Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had commanded and described the signs he had been given. Together they returned to Egypt and gathered the elders of Israel. Aaron spoke the words, and Moses performed the signs before the people. The people believed. When they heard that the Lord had visited the Israelites and had seen their affliction, they bowed down and worshipped. For the first time, the man once asked who had made him ruler and judge stood before his people with his brother beside him, and they received him. Now Moses and Aaron had to walk into Pharaoh's presence and tell the king of Egypt that the slaves he owned belonged to someone else. They entered the royal court and delivered the demand in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. Pharaoh was to let the people go into the wilderness to hold a festival to their God. Pharaoh answered with open contempt. He did not know the Lord, he said, and he would not release Israel. Moses and Aaron explained that the God of the Hebrews had met with them. They requested permission to travel 3 days into the wilderness and offer sacrifices, warning that disobedience could bring disease or violence upon them. Pharaoh heard only an excuse to stop working. He accused Moses and Aaron of distracting the laborers, then ordered them back to their burdens. That same day, he changed the terms of Israel's labor. Until then, the Egyptians had supplied the straw used in making bricks. Pharaoh ordered his taskmasters and the Israelite foremen to stop providing it. The workers would have to find straw for themselves, but their daily brick quota would remain unchanged. According to Pharaoh, their request to worship proved that they were idle. More work would force them to stop listening to what he called deceptive words. The order spread through the labor force. The Israelites scattered across Egypt, gathering stubble, trying to replace the straw that had once been supplied. At the same time, the taskmasters pressed them to produce the same number of bricks. They could not do it. The Israelite foremen were beaten and asked why their crews had failed to meet the quota. The foremen appealed directly to Pharaoh. They told him that no straw was being given to them, yet they were still commanded to make bricks. They were being beaten for a failure created by the Egyptians themselves. Pharaoh dismissed the complaint. They were idle, he repeated. That was why they kept asking to sacrifice to the Lord. They were to return to work. No straw would be provided and no reduction would be permitted. The foremen left knowing they had been trapped. On their way out, they found Moses and Aaron waiting for them. Their anger fell on the two brothers. They accused Moses and Aaron of making the Israelites repulsive to Pharaoh and his officials. In their eyes, the brothers had placed a weapon in Egyptian hands and invited their own people's destruction. The elders had believed the signs. They had bowed when they heard that God had seen their suffering. But Moses' first appearance before Pharaoh had not reduced that suffering. It had made it worse. Moses turned to God and asked why this evil had come upon the people. Why had he been sent? From the moment Moses had spoken to Pharaoh, the king had harmed Israel, and no deliverance had followed. The answer was that Pharaoh had not yet seen the hand that would force him to let Israel go. God identified himself again as the Lord who had appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and had established a covenant with them. He had heard the groaning of the Israelites. He would bring them out from under Egypt's burdens, free them from slavery, redeem them through acts of judgment, and take them as his own people. Then they would know who had brought them out. He would also bring them into the land promised to their ancestors. Moses carried this message to the Israelites, but they would not listen. Their spirits had been crushed by brutal labor. A promise of future freedom could not yet overcome what Pharaoh was doing to them each day. God sent Moses back to Pharaoh with the command to release Israel. Moses objected that his own people had not listened to him. He described his speech as unfit and asked why Pharaoh would listen. The commission did not change. The family record preserved at this point established who these brothers were. They belonged to the tribe of Levi. Their parents were Amram and Jochebed. Aaron was the older brother, and his sons would become central to Israel's priesthood. These were the same Moses and Aaron commanded to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 when they stood before Pharaoh. This time, they did not enter with a request alone. When Pharaoh demanded a sign, Aaron threw down his staff, and it became a great serpent. Pharaoh summoned his wise men and sorcerers. Egypt's magicians performed the same sign by their secret arts, each casting down a staff that became a serpent. Then Aaron's staff swallowed theirs. The sign displayed a power the court could imitate but not overcome. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard, and he refused to listen. The next confrontation came beside the Nile. Moses met Pharaoh in the morning as the king went out to the river. Aaron carried the staff that had become a serpent. Moses repeated the demand. Pharaoh was to let Israel go and worship in the wilderness. Because he had refused, the Lord would now strike the Nile. Before Pharaoh and his officials, Aaron raised the staff and struck the water. The river turned to blood. Fish died. The Nile stank, and the Egyptians could not drink from it. Water in canals, ponds, reservoirs and containers was also struck, but the Egyptian magicians produced a similar sign. Pharaoh turned and went back into his palace without taking the warning to heart. The Egyptians dug along the riverbank, searching for drinkable water. 7 days passed. Then Moses warned that if Pharaoh continued to refuse, Egypt would be overrun by frogs. They would come from the Nile and enter houses, bedrooms, ovens, and kneading bowls. They would cover officials, servants, and common people alike. Aaron stretched his hand over Egypt's waters, and the frogs came up over the land. Again, the magicians reproduced the sign. But reproducing a plague did nothing to remove it. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and asked them to pray for the frogs to be taken away. In return, he said he would let the people go and sacrifice. Moses allowed Pharaoh to choose when the frogs would be removed. Pharaoh chose the next day. Moses agreed, telling him that the answer would demonstrate that no one was like the Lord their God. Moses prayed, and the frogs in the houses, courtyards, and fields died. The Egyptians gathered them into piles, and the land reeked. When Pharaoh saw that relief had come, he hardened his heart and broke his word. Without another audience, Aaron struck the dust with his staff. The dust became gnats throughout Egypt, covering people and animals. The magicians tried to produce the same result, but this time they failed. They told Pharaoh that the plague was the finger of God. Pharaoh still would not listen. Moses was then sent to meet him again in the morning. The demand remained unchanged. If Pharaoh refused, swarms of flies would fill Egyptian houses and cover the ground. But a new distinction would be made. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, would be spared. Egypt would see that the Lord was active within the land and could separate one people from another. The swarms came. They poured into Pharaoh's palace, the houses of his officials, and communities across Egypt. The land was devastated by them. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. He offered a compromise. The Israelites could sacrifice, but they had to do it inside Egypt. Moses refused. Israel's sacrifices would be offensive to the Egyptians and could provoke them to stone the worshippers. The people needed to travel into the wilderness as they had been commanded. Pharaoh offered another concession. They could go, but not very far. He also asked Moses to pray for him. Moses agreed to pray for the removal of the flies, but he warned Pharaoh not to deceive the people again. The next day, the swarms disappeared. Not one remained. Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to release Israel. The conflict then reached Egypt's livestock. Moses warned that a severe disease would strike the horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats belonging to the Egyptians. Israel's animals would be protected. A time was set for the judgment, and it came as announced. Egyptian livestock died, while the livestock of Israel survived. Pharaoh sent investigators and learned that not even one of the Israelites' animals had died. The evidence did not change him. He continued to hold the people. Next, Moses and Aaron took handfuls of soot from a furnace. In Pharaoh's presence, Moses threw it into the air. It spread as fine dust over Egypt and produced painful boils on people and animals. The magicians who had once stood ready to match the brothers' signs could no longer remain before Moses. They too were covered with boils. Still, Pharaoh did not listen. The next warning announced a storm, unlike any Egypt had known. Moses told Pharaoh that the judgments were revealing a truth the king had rejected. No power in the land could stand as though the God of Israel did not exist. Pharaoh and his people had not been destroyed at once. Their continued survival allowed the unfolding judgments to display divine power and spread the Lord's name. Pharaoh was warned to bring servants and livestock under shelter. Anything left in the fields would die when the hail fell. Some of Pharaoh's officials now feared the warning. They hurried their servants and animals indoors. Others ignored it and left them in the open. Moses stretched his staff toward the sky. Thunder broke over Egypt. Hail fell and fire flashed through it. The storm struck people, animals, crops, and trees. Nothing like it had occurred in Egypt since it became a nation. Only Goshen was spared. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and confessed that he had sinned. He called the Lord righteous and admitted that he and his people were in the wrong. He asked Moses to pray for the thunder and hail to stop, promising that Israel could leave. Moses said he would walk outside the city, spread his hands toward the Lord, and the storm would cease. Pharaoh would know that the earth belonged to God, but Moses also told him plainly that he and his officials still did not fear the Lord. The flax and barley had been destroyed because they were mature, while the wheat and spelt, which developed later, had survived. When Moses prayed, the thunder, hail, and rain stopped. The moment Pharaoh saw that the storm had ended, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts, and Israel remained captive. Then came the warning of locusts. Moses was to confront Pharaoh again, while the memory of these signs was also being preserved for Israel's children and grandchildren. Future generations were to know what had happened in Egypt and who had brought them out. Moses and Aaron warned that locusts would cover the land if Pharaoh refused. They would consume everything left by the hail and fill the houses of Egypt. After the brothers left, Pharaoh's own officials challenged him. They asked how long Moses would remain a trap to them. Egypt, they said, was already ruined. They urged Pharaoh to let the men go and worship their God. Moses and Aaron were brought back. Pharaoh asked exactly who intended to leave. Moses answered that everyone would go, young and old, sons and daughters, flocks and herds. The festival belonged to the whole people. Pharaoh rejected the answer. He accused Moses of planning evil and offered to release only the men. Then Moses and Aaron were driven from his presence. At God's command, Moses stretched his staff over Egypt. An east wind blew across the land through the day and night. By morning, it had brought the locusts. They covered the ground until it appeared dark. They consumed what the hail had left, stripping trees and plants. No green thing remained throughout Egypt. Pharaoh urgently called for Moses and Aaron. Again, he confessed that he had sinned against their God and against them. He asked for forgiveness one more time and begged Moses to pray for the removal of what he called this death. Moses prayed. The wind shifted, becoming a powerful west wind that lifted the locusts and drove them into the sea. Not one remained in Egypt. And once again, Pharaoh refused to let Israel go. Moses then stretched his hand toward the sky, and darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. It was a darkness that could be felt. The Egyptians could not see one another, and they did not move from where they were. The Israelites had light where they lived. Pharaoh called Moses and offered one final compromise. All the Israelite people could go, including their children, but their flocks and herds had to remain behind. Moses refused. The animals were necessary for sacrifice, and Israel did not yet know what would be required in worship until they reached their destination. Not a single hoof would be left behind. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. In fury, he ordered Moses to leave and warned him never to appear before him again. If Moses saw Pharaoh's face another time, Pharaoh said he would die. Moses accepted the terms of that final threat. He told Pharaoh that he had spoken correctly. Moses would not come before him again. Before he left that final audience, however, Moses announced what the refusal would cost. At about midnight, the Lord would pass through Egypt. Every firstborn son in the land would die, from Pharaoh's firstborn, who sat upon the throne, to the firstborn of the enslaved woman working at the mill. The firstborn of the livestock would also die. A cry would rise across Egypt unlike anything heard before or after. But among the Israelites, the distinction would be complete. Not even a dog would snarl against them or their animals. Then Pharaoh's officials would come to Moses, bow before him, and beg him to take the Israelites away. Only after that would Moses leave. He walked out from Pharaoh, burning with anger. The final plague would not arrive without preparation. God gave Moses and Aaron instructions that would reshape Israel's calendar and mark the beginning of its national life. On the 10th day of the month, every household was to select a year-old male from the sheep or goats without defect. Smaller households could share with a neighbor, so the animal would be fully consumed. They were to keep it until the 14th day, then slaughter it at twilight. They were to take some of the blood and place it on the 2 doorposts and the upper frame of the house where they ate. The animal was to be roasted whole over fire and eaten that night with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Nothing was to be eaten raw or boiled in water. Anything remaining until morning was to be burned. They were not to approach this meal as people settled comfortably in their homes. They were to eat with their clothing fastened, sandals on their feet, and staffs in their hands. They were to eat in haste. That night, judgment would pass through Egypt. The blood on the doorway would identify the houses of Israel. When the Lord saw the blood, he would pass over that house, and the destroyer would not enter to strike its firstborn. This Passover was to be remembered. For 7 days, Israel would eat unleavened bread. Yeast was to be removed from their homes, and the 1st and 7th days were to be marked by sacred assemblies. The observance would teach future generations that deliverance had not been achieved by Israel's strength. Their households had been spared while Egypt was struck. Moses summoned Israel's elders and gave them the instructions. They were to slaughter the Passover animals, dip a bundle of hyssop into the blood, and touch it to the upper and side posts of their doors. No one was to go outside until morning. When their children later asked what the ceremony meant, they were to explain that it was the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the Israelite homes in Egypt while striking the Egyptians. The people bowed and worshipped. Then they went and did as they had been commanded. At midnight, the firstborn of Egypt died. Death entered Pharaoh's palace. It reached the dungeon. It struck every level of Egyptian society and the firstborn of the animals as well. Pharaoh rose during the night, along with his officials and the people of Egypt. A great cry spread through the land because there was no Egyptian house untouched by death. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron while it was still night. This time, there was no negotiation over distance, children, or livestock. He ordered the Israelites to rise and leave his people. Moses and Aaron could take the men, the women, the children, the flocks, and the herds. They could go and worship as they had demanded. Then Pharaoh, who had claimed not to know the Lord, asked Moses and Aaron to bless him also. The Egyptians urged the Israelites to leave quickly. They believed they would all die if the people remained. Israel took its dough before yeast had been added, carrying kneading bowls wrapped in clothing on their shoulders. The people also requested articles of silver and gold and asked for clothing, as Moses had instructed. The Egyptians gave what was requested. The wealth of the land that had enslaved them now left with them. The Israelites traveled from Ramesses towards Sukkoth. About 600,000 men went on foot, besides women and children. A mixed company went with them, along with large herds and flocks. They baked cakes of unleavened dough because they had been driven from Egypt and had no time to prepare provisions. After centuries of living within another kingdom, the descendants of Israel were moving out in a single night. The period associated with their dwelling in Egypt had reached 430 years. The night of their departure became a night of vigil, to be observed by the generations that followed. Instructions were also given concerning who could eat the Passover. A foreigner could participate if the males of his household were circumcised, and he joined Israel's covenant community. A temporary resident or hired worker who remained outside that bond could not eat it. The meal was to be eaten within a house, and none of the animal's bones was to be broken. The same standard applied to the native-born Israelite and the foreigner who joined them. The firstborns spared in Egypt now belonged to the Lord. Every firstborn male among Israel's livestock was to be set apart. Firstborn sons were to be redeemed rather than sacrificed. This too would provoke questions from children, and parents were to answer by telling how a mighty hand had brought them out of slavery after Pharaoh refused to release them. The Feast of Unleavened Bread and the consecration of the firstborn would keep the night of deliverance inside Israel's memory. The people leaving Egypt had seen the plagues themselves. Their descendants would know the story through practices built into the life of every household. The shortest road toward Canaan ran through the territory of the Philistines. God did not lead Israel that way. Faced quickly with war, the people could turn back toward Egypt. Instead, they were led around by the wilderness road toward the sea. They left in organized ranks, carrying something that connected this departure to the generation that had first brought Israel into Egypt. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Joseph had made the Israelites swear that when God came to their aid, they would carry his remains out of the land. The people traveled from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The cloud guided their path, and the fire gave them light to travel. The visible sign of that presence did not leave them. Then came a command that appeared to reverse their progress. Israel was told to turn back and camp near the sea. From Pharaoh's perspective, their movements would make them look confused and trapped by the wilderness. When word reached the king that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds. They asked what they had done in releasing Israel from service. The grief of the final plague had forced Pharaoh to let them go. Now the loss of their labor stirred Egypt to pursue. Pharaoh prepared his chariot and took his army. He brought 600 of Egypt's best chariots, along with the other chariots of the kingdom, each under its officers. The Egyptian force overtook Israel beside the sea. The Israelites looked up and saw Pharaoh approaching. The people who had marched out boldly became terrified. They cried to the Lord, then turned on Moses. They asked whether Egypt lacked graves, that he had brought them into the wilderness to die. They said this was exactly what they had feared. It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. Egyptian slavery had been bitter enough to make them cry for rescue. Yet with Pharaoh's army behind them and the sea ahead, slavery suddenly appeared safer than freedom. Moses told them not to be afraid. They were to stand firm and watch the deliverance the Lord would accomplish. The Egyptians they saw that day would never be seen alive again. The Lord would fight for them. They needed to remain still. Then God told Moses that this was not the moment to remain still. He was to command Israel to move forward. Moses was to raise his staff and stretch his hand over the sea. The waters would divide, and the Israelites would go through on dry ground. Pharaoh and his army would follow, and Egypt would finally know the power it had resisted. The angel of God who had traveled before Israel moved behind them. The pillar of cloud also shifted from the front of the camp to the rear, standing between Israel and the Egyptians. Darkness covered one side, while light illuminated the other. Through the night, the two camps did not come together. Moses stretched his hand over the sea. A powerful east wind drove the water back throughout the night, turning the seabed into dry ground. The waters divided. Israel went into the sea. The people crossed on dry ground, with water like a wall on their right and on their left. Families, flocks, carts, and the remains of Joseph passed through the corridor opened before them. The Egyptians pursued. Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen followed Israel into the sea. During the morning watch, the Lord looked down upon the Egyptian force from the pillar of fire and cloud, and threw the army into confusion. Their chariot wheels became difficult to move. The Egyptians recognized that the Lord was fighting for Israel against them. They tried to retreat. Then Moses was commanded to stretch his hand over the sea again. At daybreak, the water returned to its normal depth. The Egyptians fled toward it, but the sea swept over them. The waters covered the chariots, horsemen, and the army that had followed Israel into the passage. Not one of them survived. The Israelites stood on the other side. They had crossed on dry ground, but the waters had closed over their pursuers. Along the shore, they saw the bodies of the Egyptians. The immediate military power that had enslaved them, chased them, and promised to drag them back was gone. Israel saw what had been done against Egypt. The people feared the Lord, and they trusted him and his servant Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang. They sang of the Lord's triumph, of horse and rider thrown into the sea. They called him their strength and their salvation, a warrior whose power had shattered the enemy. Pharaoh's chariots and officers had sunk beneath the waters. The depths had covered them, and they had fallen like stone. The song looked back at Egypt's confidence. The enemy had spoken of pursuit, capture, plunder, and destruction. One breath had covered them with the sea. It also looked ahead. The nations would hear and tremble. Israel had not been delivered merely to wander away from Egypt. The people were being led toward the place promised for them, toward the sanctuary of their God and the land where he would reign. Miriam, the prophetess and sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand. The women followed her with tambourines and dancing. She answered the song by calling Israel to sing of the Lord's great triumph, because the horse and its rider had been thrown into the sea. Their voices rose from the far shore as a free people. Egypt could no longer command them. But beyond the song lay the wilderness, and freedom would ask something of Israel that slavery never had. They would have to move forward without knowing where their next water or meal would come from. The first test came almost immediately. Moses led the people away from the sea and into the wilderness of Shur. They traveled for 3 days without finding water. When they finally reached a place where water was present, they could not drink it because it was bitter. The place became known as Mara, a name connected to that bitterness. The people complained to Moses and asked what they were supposed to drink. Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There, Israel received a command and was tested. The people were told to listen carefully, do what was right, and keep the commands given to them. The diseases inflicted upon Egypt would not be placed upon Israel if they obeyed the God who healed them. From Mara, they traveled to Elim, where they found 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They camped there beside the water. But Elim was only a resting place. When the people moved into the wilderness of Sin, between Elim and Sinai, the food they had carried from Egypt was no longer enough to quiet their fear. The whole community complained against Moses and Aaron. They said it would have been better if the Lord had killed them in Egypt, where they remembered sitting beside pots of meat and eating bread until they were full. Now they accused the brothers. The entire assembly had been brought into the wilderness to die of hunger. Once again, danger changed the way they remembered slavery. Egypt had taken their sons, beaten their foremen, and controlled their labor. Hunger reduced that history to the memory of full stomachs. God told Moses that bread would rain from heaven. The people were to go out each day and gather only what they needed for that day. Their willingness to follow the instructions would test whether they could live by trust rather than accumulation. On the 6th day, they were to gather twice the usual amount. Moses and Aaron told the people that by evening they would know it was the Lord who had brought them out of Egypt. In the morning they would see his glory, because their complaints had been heard. The people thought they were speaking against Moses and Aaron, but the brothers asked what power they possessed to feed an entire nation. The deeper complaint was against the God who had led Israel there. As Aaron spoke to the assembly, the people looked toward the wilderness. The glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. That evening quail came and covered the camp. In the morning a layer of dew lay around it. When the dew lifted, thin flakes remained on the ground, fine as frost. The Israelites looked at one another and asked, "What is it?" Moses told them this was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. Each person was to gather according to need, measured by the number of people in the household. The Israelites gathered different amounts, some more and some less. Yet when the portions were measured, those who had gathered much had nothing left over, and those who had gathered little had enough. No one was to save any until morning. Some refused to listen. They kept part of it overnight, and by morning it was filled with worms and smelled foul. Moses became angry with them. Every morning, the people gathered what they needed. When the sun grew hot, what remained on the ground melted away. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much. The leaders of the community came to Moses because this differed from the daily rule. He explained that the next day would be a Sabbath, a holy rest dedicated to the Lord. They could bake or boil what they needed and preserve the remainder for the next day. This time, the stored food did not stink or fill with worms. Moses told the people to eat it on the Sabbath because no bread would appear in the fields that day. For 6 days they could gather. The seventh was a day of rest. Even so, some went out on the seventh day looking for food. They found nothing. The Lord confronted their refusal to follow the instructions. The Sabbath had been given to them, and the double portion on the sixth day allowed every person to remain where they were on the seventh. The people began to rest. They called the bread manna, echoing the question they had asked when they first saw it. It was white, like coriander seed, and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses instructed Aaron to place a measured portion in a jar and preserve it before the Lord so future generations could see the food Israel had eaten in the wilderness. The people would depend upon manna throughout their years of wandering until they reached the border of inhabited land. For the moment, it solved the crisis of hunger, but the camp moved again, traveling by stages until the people reached Rephidim. There was no water to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and demanded that he give them water. Moses asked why they were directing the quarrel at him and why they were putting the Lord to the test. Their thirst intensified. They accused Moses of bringing them out of Egypt to kill them, their children, and their livestock. Moses cried out to the Lord and asked what he should do. The people were nearly ready to stone him. He was told to walk ahead of the assembly with some of Israel's elders. He was also to carry the staff with which the Nile had been struck. God would stand before him at a rock near Horeb. Moses was to strike the rock, and water would come from it for the people to drink. Moses did so in the sight of the elders. Water came from the rock. He named the place Massah and Meribah, names associated with testing and quarreling, because Israel had challenged the Lord with the question that lay beneath each complaint. Was the Lord truly among them or not? At the sea, they had seen a path opened through water. In the wilderness, they now needed water opened from stone. Each rescue answered the immediate danger. None guaranteed that they would trust when the next danger appeared. At Rephidim, danger came not from thirst, but from an enemy. The Amalekites attacked Israel. Moses told Joshua to choose men and go out to fight them. It was Joshua's first appearance in the story, and he entered it as a battlefield commander. Moses would stand on the hill with the staff of God in his hand. Joshua led the chosen men against Amalek. Moses climbed the hill with Aaron and Hur. As long as Moses held up his hands, Israel gained the advantage. When his hands dropped, Amalek began to prevail. Moses' arms grew tired. Aaron and Hur placed a stone beneath him so he could sit. Then they stood on either side and supported his hands, keeping them steady until sunset. Below them, Joshua overcame the Amalekite force with the sword. The victory joined several forms of leadership. Joshua fought in the valley. Chosen men stood with him. Moses held the staff on the hill. Aaron and Hur held Moses when he could no longer hold himself. God told Moses to write the event on a scroll as a memorial and make certain Joshua heard it. Amalek's name would be opposed and ultimately blotted out. Moses built an altar and named it to declare that the Lord was Israel's banner. The attack had ended, but the conflict with Amalek would continue through later generations. News of what had happened traveled beyond the camp. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, heard what God had done for Moses and Israel and how the people had been brought out of Egypt. He came into the wilderness, bringing Zipporah, Moses' wife, and her 2 sons. Moses had named the first Gershom because he had lived as a foreigner. The second was named Eleazar, a name that remembered how the God of Moses' father had helped him and delivered him from Pharaoh's sword. Moses went out to meet Jethro. He bowed and kissed him, and they asked about one another's well-being before entering the tent. There, Moses told his father-in-law what the Lord had done to Pharaoh and Egypt for Israel's sake. He described the hardships along the way and how the people had been rescued from each one. Jethro rejoiced over the good that had been done for Israel. He blessed the Lord for delivering Moses and the people from Pharaoh and freeing them from Egyptian power. The events led Jethro to declare that the Lord was greater than all other gods. Egypt had acted arrogantly against Israel, and the power behind Egypt had been broken. Jethro brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. Aaron and Israel's elders joined him for a meal in the presence of God. The reunion gave Moses the chance to tell the story of Israel's rescue. What Jethro saw the next day revealed a problem created by that rescue. Moses sat to judge disputes among the people. From morning until evening, the Israelites stood around him waiting for decisions. Jethro asked why Moses was doing this alone and why the people had to stand there all day. Moses explained that they came to him to seek God's direction. When disputes arose, he decided between the parties and taught them God's decrees and instructions. Jethro told him plainly that this arrangement was not good. Moses and the people would wear themselves out. The burden was too heavy for one man to carry alone. Moses still had a necessary role. He was to represent the people before God and bring their difficult matters to him. He was also to teach the people the commands and show them how they were to live. But ordinary judgment needed to be shared. Jethro advised Moses to select capable men from among the people, men who feared God, could be trusted and hated dishonest gain. He was to appoint them as leaders over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. These leaders would judge the people's regular disputes. They would bring the most difficult cases to Moses and decide the simpler ones themselves. By sharing the load, they would make it possible for Moses to endure and for the people to receive justice without spending the entire day waiting around him. Moses listened to his father-in-law. He chose capable men from Israel and placed them over the people. They judged routine cases, while the difficult matters still came to Moses. The man who had once tried to settle violence by himself and had been asked who made him a ruler and judge was now learning that even rightful authority could fail if he tried to carry it alone. Afterward, Moses sent Jethro on his way, and his father-in-law returned to his own land. Israel remained in the wilderness with food appearing each morning, water provided in the dry country, enemies driven back, and judges appointed throughout the camp. They had survived the road from the sea. Before them stood the mountain, where the voice that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush would address the nation itself. In the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, the Israelites entered the wilderness of Sinai and camped in front of the mountain. Moses climbed toward God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. He was to remind Israel of what the people had already seen, what had been done to Egypt, and how they had been carried out and brought to this place. Then came an offer that defined what their freedom was for. If Israel listened and kept the covenant, the people would become God's treasured possession among all nations. The whole earth belonged to him, But Israel would have a distinct calling, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Moses returned to the camp and summoned the elders. He placed the words before them, and the people answered together that they would do everything the Lord had said. Moses carried their answer back up the mountain. God told him that he would come in a dense cloud. The people would hear God speaking with Moses and would learn to trust Moses as the appointed mediator. But they could not approach the meeting casually. Moses was to consecrate the people. They were to wash their clothes and prepare for the third day. A boundary was placed around the mountain. No person or animal was to touch it. Anyone who crossed the limit would die. The God who had come down to rescue Israel was now coming down among them, and nearness required restraint. Moses descended and prepared the people. They washed their clothes and waited. On the morning of the third day, thunder and lightning broke over the mountain. A thick cloud covered it, and the blast of a trumpet grew so powerful that everyone in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out to meet God, and they stood at the foot of Sinai. Smoke covered the mountain because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a furnace, and the entire mountain shook violently. As the trumpet sounded louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him. Moses was called to the summit. Even then, he was immediately sent back down to warn the people not to force their way through the boundary to look. The priests also had to consecrate themselves before approaching. Moses answered that the people could not climb Sinai because the boundary had already been established. But the warning was repeated. Moses was to descend and return with Aaron. The priests and the people were not to break through. He went down and spoke to them. Then God addressed Israel. The words began with identity and rescue. He was the Lord their God, who had brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery. Because of that relationship, Israel was to recognize no other gods. They were not to make an idol in the form of anything in heaven, on earth, or in the waters. They were not to bow before such images or serve them. Their worship could not be transferred to a visible object they controlled. They were not to misuse the name of the Lord. They were to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days were given for labor, but the seventh belonged to the Lord. Sons, daughters, servants, foreigners, and animals were included in the rest. They were to honor father and mother. They were not to murder. They were not to commit adultery. They were not to steal. They were not to give false testimony against a neighbor. And they were not to covet a neighbor's house, spouse, servants, animals, or anything that belonged to another person. The people saw the lightning, heard the trumpet and thunder, and watched the mountain smoking. They shook with fear and kept their distance. They begged Moses to speak with them himself. They would listen to him, but they feared they would die if God continued speaking directly to them. Moses told them not to be afraid. God had come to test them, so the fear of him would remain before them and restrain them from sin. The people stayed back while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. From that point, the commands moved into the disputes and pressures of ordinary life. Israel had been told whom to worship. Now the people were shown how their new community was to handle power, injury, property, poverty, truth, worship, and justice. They were not to make gods of silver or gold. When they built an altar, they could use earth or uncut stone. An altar was not to become a monument to human craftsmanship or a platform for display. Regulations concerning servants placed limits on terms of service and established conditions for release. A Hebrew man was not to be held indefinitely. The law also addressed the more vulnerable position of a female servant and required rights that could not simply be withdrawn. Violent acts were distinguished from accidents. Deliberate murder carried a different consequence from an unintended death. Striking or cursing a parent, kidnapping a person, and causing serious bodily harm were treated as grave offenses. The judgments required accountability when one person injured another. Compensation could be owed for lost time and recovery. harm to a pregnant woman, permanent injury to a servant, and death caused by a dangerous animal were not dismissed as private misfortunes. The principle of measured justice appeared in the language of life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and wound for wound. The penalty was not to expand through vengeance beyond the injury being judged. Responsibility also extended to preventable danger. A person who left an open pit could be liable when an animal fell into it. An owner who knew an ox was dangerous and failed to restrain it bore greater responsibility if the animal killed someone. Theft required restitution. A thief who stole livestock could owe several times what had been taken. Damage caused by grazing animals or an uncontrolled fire also had to be repaid. Disputes over borrowed, entrusted, or missing property were brought before judges rather than settled by private retaliation. The commands guarded Israel's covenant identity and its vulnerable people. The people were forbidden to exploit a foreign resident because they themselves knew what it was to live as foreigners in Egypt. They were not to mistreat widows or fatherless children. Their cries would be heard just as Israel's cry had been heard under slavery. A poor Israelite was not to be treated as an opportunity for profit through interest. If a person's cloak was taken as security for a loan, it had to be returned before night, because that garment might be the only covering the borrower possessed. Respect was required toward God and toward appointed leaders. First fruits and firstborn offerings were not to be withheld. Justice could not be shaped by a crowd. False reports were forbidden. A witness was not to join others in twisting a case, whether to favor the powerful or to show improper partiality toward the poor. Even hostility toward another person did not cancel responsibility. If an enemy's wandering ox or donkey was found, it had to be returned. If the animal of someone who hated you had collapsed under its load, you were not free to walk away. Judges were warned against false charges, the execution of the innocent, and bribes that distorted clear judgment. The rhythm of work and rest expanded beyond the weekly Sabbath. Fields were to be cultivated for 6 years and left uncultivated in the 7th, allowing the poor to eat what grew and leaving the remainder for wild animals. 3 annual festivals would gather Israel before God: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, recalling the departure from Egypt, the Feast of Harvest at the beginning of the produce, and the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the agricultural year. The first and best of the land's produce belonged before the Lord. Worship would shape the calendar that once had been controlled by Pharaoh's quotas. God also promised to send a messenger ahead of Israel on the road toward the land. The people were to listen and not rebel. The inhabitants of Canaan worshipped other gods, and Israel was neither to bow to those gods nor imitate their practices. The nations would not all be removed in a single moment. If the land became empty too quickly, wild animals would multiply against Israel. Possession would unfold little by little as the people increased. The boundaries described for Israel stretched from the sea near the wilderness to the Mediterranean and from the southern wilderness toward the Euphrates. But the people were not to make covenants with the inhabitants or their gods. Those relationships would become a trap, drawing Israel into the very worship it had been commanded to reject. Moses returned from the darkness and told the people all the words and judgments he had received. Again, they answered with one voice that they would do everything the Lord had spoken. Moses wrote down the words. Early the next morning, he built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Young Israelite men offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as fellowship offerings. Moses collected half the blood in bowls and splashed the other half against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it aloud to the people. For a third time, they accepted the obligation. They said they would do all the Lord had spoken and would obey. Moses took the blood from the bowls and scattered it over the people. He declared it to be the blood of the covenant established with them according to the words they had heard. The promise at the mountain was no longer only an offer. The commands had been spoken, written, read, accepted, and sealed. Then Moses climbed the mountain with Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of Israel's elders. They saw the God of Israel. Beneath his feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Though these leaders had come near, God did not strike them down. They saw God and they ate and drank. After that covenant meal, Moses was summoned higher. God told him to come up and remain there. Moses would receive stone tablets containing the law and commands for the instruction of the people. Moses rose with Joshua, his assistant. Before leaving the elders, he told them to wait until he returned. Aaron and Hur would remain available to settle disputes. Moses and Joshua began the ascent. Then Moses went into the cloud. The cloud covered Sinai, and the glory of the Lord settled upon the mountain. For 6 days Moses waited. On the 7th day, God called to him from within the cloud. To the Israelites below, the glory on the summit looked like a consuming fire. Moses entered the cloud and continued upward. For 40 days and 40 nights he remained on the mountain, while the nation that had sworn obedience waited below. There, Moses received the design for a place where the God who had descended upon the mountain would dwell among the people. Israel was to contribute the materials freely: gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, colored yarn, animal skins, wood, oil, spices, and precious stones would be gathered from those willing to give. At the center of the sanctuary would stand a chest made of acacia wood and covered with gold, the Ark of the Covenant. Rings and poles would allow it to be carried without direct contact. The stone tablets were to be placed inside it. A gold cover would rest over the ark, with 2 cherubim facing one another and spreading their wings above it. There, above the cover, God would meet with Moses and give commands for Israel. A table would hold the bread of the presence. A lampstand, made from a single piece of hammered gold, would branch like a flowering tree and provide light inside the sacred tent. The tabernacle itself was designed as a portable sanctuary, constructed from curtains, frames, coverings, clasps, and bases that could be assembled in the wilderness and carried when the camp moved. An inner curtain would separate the most holy place where the ark stood from the outer room containing the table and lampstand. Outside the tent would stand a bronze altar for sacrifices and a courtyard enclosed by curtains. Every proportion, material, utensil, and boundary reinforced the movement from the ordinary camp toward the place of divine presence. Aaron and his sons were chosen to serve as priests. Sacred garments would set them apart for that work. Aaron's high priestly clothing included an ephod, a breastpiece bearing stones engraved with the names of Israel's tribes, a robe, a turban, and a gold plate declaring holiness to the Lord. When Aaron entered the sanctuary, he would carry the names of the tribes before God. The priest did not come as an isolated man. He represented the people. The priests were to be washed, clothed, anointed, and ordained through sacrifices. Blood would mark the altar and touch Aaron and his sons. For 7 days, the ordination would be repeated, setting apart both the priests and the altar for service. Regular offerings were to be made every morning and evening. God promised to meet with Israel at the entrance to the tent and consecrate the place by his glory. The purpose of the sanctuary reached back to the Exodus itself. Israel had been brought out of Egypt so that God might dwell among them. Instructions followed for an altar of incense, a census contribution for the sanctuary, a bronze basin for priestly washing, sacred anointing oil, and incense reserved for worship. The work would require skill as well as materials. Bezalel of the tribe of Judah was named as the chief craftsman, filled with ability to design and work in metal, stone, wood, and fabric. Oholiab of Dan was appointed to assist him, along with other skilled workers. Even this sacred construction could not erase the Sabbath. The people were to work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. The Sabbath remained a sign of the covenant between God and Israel. When the instructions were complete, Moses received 2 tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. Below the cloud, the people had lost sight of him. They saw that Moses was taking a long time to descend, so they gathered around Aaron. They told him to make gods who would go before them, because they did not know what had happened to the man who brought them out of Egypt. Aaron told them to remove the gold earrings worn by their wives, sons, and daughters. The people brought the gold to him. He fashioned it into the image of a calf. The people identified the image with the gods who had brought them out of Egypt. Aaron built an altar before it and announced a festival to the Lord. The next day, the people offered sacrifices. Then they sat down to eat and drink and rose up in celebration. While Moses was receiving instructions for a sanctuary that Israel had freely promised to build, Israel used its gold to create an image it had explicitly promised not to worship. God told Moses to go down. The people Moses had brought from Egypt had corrupted themselves and quickly turned from the commanded way. They were a stiff-necked people. Then Moses heard a devastating proposal. God would destroy Israel and make a great nation from Moses instead. Moses pleaded for the people. He asked why divine anger should consume those brought out of Egypt with great power. The Egyptians would say Israel had been rescued only to be killed in the mountains. Moses appealed to the promises sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that their descendants would multiply and inherit the land. The announced destruction was withheld. Moses turned and descended carrying the 2 tablets inscribed on both sides. Joshua, who had waited for him on the mountain, heard the noise from the camp and thought it sounded like battle. Moses answered that it was neither the cry of victory nor the cry of defeat. It was the sound of singing. When he approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned. He threw the tablets from his hands, and they shattered at the foot of the mountain. The broken stones made visible what Israel had already done to the covenant written upon them. Moses seized the calf, burned it, ground it into powder, scattered the powder over water, and made the Israelites drink it. Then he confronted Aaron. He asked what the people had done to him that he had brought such great sin upon them. Aaron told Moses not to be angry. He pointed to the people's inclination toward evil. They had asked him to make gods because they did not know what had happened to Moses. Aaron said he had collected their gold, thrown it into the fire, and the calf had come out. Moses saw that the people were out of control and that Aaron had allowed them to become an object of ridicule before their enemies. He stood at the entrance to the camp and called for those who were on the Lord's side to come to him. The Levites gathered around. Moses ordered them to move through the camp in judgment, even when the guilty were relatives or neighbors. About 3,000 men died that day. The following day, Moses told the people that they had committed a great sin. He would return to God and seek atonement for them. On the mountain, Moses confessed what Israel had done. The people had made a god of gold. He asked for their sin to be forgiven. If it would not be forgiven, Moses asked to be blotted from the book God had written. The answer did not accept Moses as a substitute for the guilty. The one who sinned would be blotted out. Moses was to continue leading the people toward the promised place, and an angel would go before them. But judgment had not vanished. A plague struck the people because of the calf Aaron had made. Then came another consequence. Israel was commanded to leave Sinai and continue toward the promised land, but God's immediate presence would not travel among them. Their stubbornness created the danger that they would be consumed on the way. The people mourned when they heard this. They removed their ornaments and did not put them on again. Moses took a tent and pitched it outside the camp at a distance. He called it the tent of meeting. Anyone seeking the Lord went outside the camp to it. Whenever Moses walked to the tent, the people stood at the entrances of their own tents and watched. The pillar of cloud descended and remained at the entrance while God spoke with Moses. Seeing the pillar, the people bowed in worship. The Lord spoke with Moses directly, as one speaks with a friend. Afterward, Moses returned to the camp, but Joshua remained at the tent. Moses refused to treat the promised land as enough without the promised presence. He told God that he had been commanded to lead the people, yet he needed to know who would be sent with him. If Moses truly had found favor, he asked to be shown God's ways, and he reminded God that this nation was still his people. The answer came: God's presence would go with Moses, and he would be given rest. Moses pressed the matter further. If that presence did not go with them, there was no reason to lead Israel away from Sinai. The only thing that distinguished Moses and Israel from every other people was that God went with them. The request was granted. Then Moses asked to see God's glory. He was told that divine goodness would pass before him and that the name of the Lord would be proclaimed. But Moses could not see God's face and live. A place was prepared beside God. Moses would stand on a rock and be placed in a cleft as the glory passed. He would be covered until the moment of danger had gone, then allowed to see what followed, but not the divine face. Before this meeting, Moses was commanded to cut 2 new stone tablets like the ones he had broken. He was to climb Sinai alone in the morning. No one else could come onto the mountain, and even the flocks were to be kept away. Moses cut the tablets and ascended as commanded. The Lord descended in the cloud, stood with him, and proclaimed the divine name. Moses heard of mercy and grace, patience, faithful love, forgiveness and justice that did not treat guilt as though it did not exist. Moses immediately bowed to the ground. He asked again for God to travel among them. Israel was stiff-necked. That was no longer disputed. Yet Moses pleaded for pardon and asked that the people be received as God's inheritance. The covenant was renewed. Israel was warned again not to make agreements with the inhabitants of the land or adopt their worship. Pagan altars and sacred objects were to be torn down. No cast idols were to be made. The commands concerning the feast of unleavened bread, the firstborn, Sabbath rest, annual festivals, first fruits, and proper sacrifice were given again. Israel's calendar, work, worship, families, and harvests were all to acknowledge the covenant they had nearly abandoned. Moses remained with the Lord for another 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. The covenant words were inscribed upon the new tablets. Then Moses descended Sinai carrying them. He did not know that his face was shining because he had spoken with God. Aaron and the Israelites saw the radiance and were afraid to approach. Moses called them back. Aaron and the leaders came first, then the rest of the people, and Moses gave them the commands he had received. When he finished speaking, he placed a veil over his face. He removed it when he entered the divine presence, then returned to tell Israel what he had been commanded. The people would see the radiance before he covered his face again. Moses had gone up carrying the evidence of a broken covenant and returned with new tablets. Israel had survived its first great act of rebellion. Now the people had to take the gold once used for an idol and build the sanctuary where the presence Moses fought to preserve would dwell among them. Moses assembled the people and repeated that even this work would not override the Sabbath. 6 days were available for labor, but the 7th remained a day of complete rest. Then he invited everyone with a willing heart to contribute what the sanctuary required. The response spread across the camp. Men and women brought jewelry, metals, fabrics, skins, wood, oil, spices, and precious stones. Skilled women spun yarn and linen. Tribal leaders supplied gems for the priestly garments and ingredients for anointing oil and incense. Bezalel and Oholiab led the craftsmen. They received the contributions and began the work with the other skilled men and women. But the gifts kept coming. Each morning, people brought more until the craftsmen left their work and told Moses that Israel had already provided more than enough. Moses sent a command through the camp that no one should bring anything else. The people had to be restrained from giving. The craftsmen made the tabernacle's curtains, frames, coverings, inner veil, and entrance screen. They constructed the ark and its gold cover, the table, lampstand, incense altar, bronze altar, washing basin, and courtyard. The bronze basin was made using mirrors donated by women who served near the entrance to the tent of meeting. Bezalel prepared the sacred oil and incense. The priestly garments were woven, and the stones bearing the names of Israel's tribes were mounted upon Aaron's ephod and breastpiece. When the work was finished, the people brought everything to Moses. He inspected it carefully. The craftsman had followed the design he had received. Moses saw that the work had been completed as commanded, and he blessed them. On the first day of the first month, nearly a year after leaving Egypt, Moses set up the tabernacle. He placed its bases, frames, crossbars, posts, and coverings. He put the tablets inside the ark, attached the carrying poles, and placed the gold cover over it. Then he carried the ark into the inner room and hung the veil. He arranged the table and its bread, set up the lampstand and lit its lamps, placed the gold altar before the veil, and burned incense. He positioned the bronze altar and basin in the courtyard. Moses washed Aaron and his sons, clothed them in the priestly garments, and anointed them for service. He also anointed the sanctuary and everything within it. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter because the cloud rested upon it so completely. The presence Israel had nearly lost now occupied the sanctuary Israel had built. The mountain of meeting had, in a sense, moved into the center of the camp. From then on, the cloud would govern Israel's travel. When it lifted from the tabernacle, the people would set out. When it remained, they would stay. By day, the cloud was visible over the sanctuary, and by night fire appeared within it before all Israel. The presence at the center also created the need for a complete order of approach. Through Moses, Israel received instructions for sacrifices. A burnt offering expressed complete dedication. Grain offerings presented the produce of the land. Fellowship offerings became meals shared in peace before God. Sin and guilt offerings addressed defilement, wrongdoing, restitution, and forgiveness. Different animals and portions were required according to the offering and the circumstances. The poor were not excluded. Less costly offerings were permitted when larger animals were beyond a person's means. Priests were taught how to handle the blood, fat, meat, grain, fire, and ashes. The altar fire was to be kept burning. Sacred food had to be eaten within established boundaries. What entered the sanctuary could not be treated as ordinary. Then Moses ordained Aaron and his sons before the assembly. He washed them, clothed Aaron in the high priestly garments, anointed the tabernacle and altar, and poured anointing oil over Aaron's head. Sacrifices were offered, and blood was placed on the right ears, thumbs, and toes of Aaron and his sons, marking their hearing, work, and walk for priestly service. For 7 days, they remained at the entrance of the tent. On the 8th day, Aaron began his public ministry. Offerings were presented for the priests and the people. Moses and Aaron entered the tent, then came out and blessed the assembly. The glory of the Lord appeared, and fire came from the divine presence and consumed the offering on the altar. The people shouted and fell face down. Then Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, placed fire and incense in them, and offered unauthorized fire that had not been commanded. Fire came from the Lord and consumed them. The same presence that had accepted the sacrifice in view of the people now killed 2 newly ordained priests for approaching it on their own terms. Moses reminded Aaron that God would be shown holy among those who came near. Aaron remained silent. Relatives carried the bodies outside the camp. Aaron and his remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, were forbidden from abandoning their priestly duty to take part in the normal signs of mourning. The wider community could mourn, but the anointed priests remained at the sanctuary. They were also warned not to drink wine or other fermented drink when entering the tent. The priests had to distinguish between holy and common, clean and unclean, and teach Israel the commands given through Moses. Later that day, Moses discovered that a required sin offering had been burned rather than eaten by the priests. He became angry with Eleazar and Ithamar. Aaron answered that after the events of that day, eating the offering would not have been acceptable in his sight. Moses heard the explanation and accepted it. The laws of purity expanded the distinction the priests were charged to preserve. Foods, childbirth, skin diseases, contaminated fabrics and houses, bodily discharges, and contact with death all affected whether a person could enter sacred space. Uncleanness was not treated as identical to deliberate wrongdoing, but it still required separation, washing, time, examination, or sacrifice before a person returned to the community's holy life. The deaths of Nadab and Abihu formed the background to the instructions for the Day of Atonement. Aaron could not enter the most holy place whenever he chose. Once each year, after washing and dressing in linen garments, the high priest would bring sacrifices for himself, his household, and Israel. Incense would cover the ark with smoke. Blood would cleanse the sanctuary from the defilements of the people. 2 goats were presented for Israel. 1 was sacrificed. Over the other, Aaron confessed the people's sins and sent it into the wilderness, symbolically carrying their offenses away from the camp. The sanctuary stood among Israel, but the nation's continuing failures could not be allowed to accumulate there without cleansing. Other commands shaped the people as a holy community. Blood was not to be consumed because the life of a creature was in its blood. Sexual relationships were bounded. Parents and the elderly were to be honored. Idols, occult practices, dishonest measures, and exploitation were forbidden. Harvesters were not to strip every edge of a field or gather every fallen piece of fruit. Some was to remain for the poor and the foreign resident. The people were not to steal, lie, withhold wages, curse the deaf, place an obstacle before the blind, or twist judgment. Hatred was not to be nursed in secret, and vengeance was forbidden. Israel was commanded to love a neighbor as oneself. Priests were held to stricter requirements because they handled holy things. The calendar of sacred gatherings was established around Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, weeks, trumpets, atonement, and shelters. The land itself received a Sabbath every 7th year. After 7 cycles of 7 years, the Jubilee proclaimed liberty, returned hereditary property, and interrupted permanent Israelite enslavement. The land could not be treated as an unlimited possession because it belonged to God, and Israel lived upon it as a dependent people. Promises of security and abundance stood beside warnings of escalating disaster if Israel broke the covenant. The same relationship that gave the people a place could remove them from it. One public violation showed how seriously the covenant name was guarded. A man born to an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father fought with another man and blasphemed the divine name. He was held until the judgment was made clear, then taken outside the camp and stoned by the assembly. Instructions concerning vows and dedicated property completed this body of law at Sinai. The camp itself now had to be organized. In the second month of the second year after the Exodus, Moses and Aaron counted the men 20 years old and above who were able to serve in Israel's army. Tribal leaders assisted them. The total was 603,550, not including the tribe of Levi. The tribes received assigned positions around the tabernacle. Judah's division camped on the east and would lead the march. Reuben's division stood to the south, Ephraim's to the west, and Dan's to the north. The Levites camped between the other tribes and the sanctuary. Their position formed a protective boundary around the holy place. Aaron's surviving sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, continued as priests. Nadab and Abihu had left no sons. The Levites were taken for sanctuary service in place of Israel's firstborn. Their clans received distinct responsibilities. The Gershonites carried curtains and coverings. The Merarites carried frames, posts, bases, and structural pieces. The Kohathites carried the most sacred furnishings after Aaron and his sons had covered them. They were warned not to enter and look at the uncovered holy objects or touch them, or they would die. After the eligible workers were counted, 8,580 Levite men were assigned to carry and serve the tent of meeting. The camp was purified, restitution laws were enforced, and provisions were given for special vows of dedication. Aaron and his sons received the words with which they were to bless Israel, asking that the Lord bless and protect the people, shine upon them with favor, and give them peace. The tribal leaders brought offerings for the altar over 12 days. The Levites were cleansed and presented for their work. The lamps were arranged to shine before the lampstand. Then Israel observed Passover at Sinai. When men made unclean through contact with a dead body asked why they should be excluded, a second Passover date was provided for those prevented by uncleanness or travel. The foreigner living among Israel could also observe it under the same rule. Finally, 2 silver trumpets were made. Their different signals would summon the community, gather the leaders, sound an alarm for departure, accompany battle, and mark Israel's festivals and offerings. The sanctuary stood ready. The priests had been warned, the Levites assigned, the tribes counted, and the marching order established. Above them the cloud still rested over the tabernacle. All that remained was for it to rise. On the 20th day of the second month, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle. The signals were sounded, the tribes broke camp in their assigned order, and the sanctuary was dismantled for transport. For the first time, Israel moved away from Sinai as an organized nation. The cloud led them toward the wilderness of Paran. Moses asked Hobab, the son of his Midianite relative Reuel, to travel with them. Hobab knew the wilderness and could help them identify suitable places to camp. Moses promised that whatever good God gave Israel would be shared with him. The ark went ahead as the people traveled for 3 days, seeking a resting place. The cloud remained over them. Whenever the ark set out, Moses called upon the Lord to rise and scatter Israel's enemies. Whenever it came to rest, he asked the Lord to return to the countless thousands of Israel. The carefully ordered march did not remain peaceful for long. The people began complaining about their hardships. The Lord heard them, and fire burned along the outskirts of the camp. They cried to Moses. He prayed, and the fire died down. The place was named Taberah because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. Then the mixed company traveling with Israel began craving other food. The Israelites joined them and wept, asking who would give them meat. They remembered the fish they had eaten in Egypt, along with cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. They described those foods as costing them nothing. The forced labor, beatings, and dead children disappeared from the comparison. All they could see before them was manna. Families stood weeping at the entrances to their tents. Moses heard them, and the burden broke through his endurance. He asked God why the entire people had been placed upon him. Had he conceived them? Had he given birth to them? Yet he was expected to carry them like an infant all the way to the promised land. They were demanding meat, and Moses had none to give. He said he could not carry the nation alone. The weight was too heavy. If this was how he was to be treated, Moses asked to be killed, rather than forced to watch his own ruin unfold. The answer addressed both the burden and the craving. Moses was to gather 70 elders whom he knew to be recognized leaders. They would stand with him at the tent of meeting. The Spirit placed upon Moses would also rest upon them, and they would help carry the people. Israel was also told to prepare for meat. They would not eat it for 1 day, 2 days, or even 10. They would eat it for an entire month until it became repulsive to them, because they had rejected the God among them and wept for Egypt. Moses looked at the scale of the promise. There were 600,000 men on foot, and God had spoken of feeding the entire population with meat for a month. Moses asked whether all the flocks and herds could provide enough, or whether the fish of the sea could satisfy them. God answered with a question: had the Lord's power become limited? Moses gathered the 70 elders around the tent. The Lord descended in the cloud, spoke with him, and placed upon the elders the Spirit that rested on Moses. When the Spirit came upon them, they prophesied. 2 of the registered elders, Eldad and Medad, had remained in the camp rather than coming to the tent. The Spirit rested upon them there, and they also prophesied. A young man ran to report this to Moses. Joshua urged Moses to stop them. Moses asked whether Joshua was defending his position. He wished that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Spirit rested upon every one of them. The authority given to the elders did not diminish Moses. It answered his plea that he could not carry Israel alone. Then a wind drove quail in from the sea and dropped them in enormous numbers around the camp. The people gathered them throughout that day, through the night, and into the following day. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it had been consumed, a severe plague struck. The dead were buried there, and the place became known as Kibroth Hattava, the graves of craving. From there, the people traveled to Hazeroth. Now the challenge came from inside Moses' own family. Miriam and Aaron spoke against him concerning the Cushite woman he had married. They also asked whether the Lord had spoken only through Moses. Had he not spoken through them as well? The Lord heard them. Moses did not answer by defending his rank. He was described as more humble than anyone on earth. God suddenly summoned Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting. The 3 went out, and the Lord descended in the pillar of cloud. Aaron and Miriam were called forward. They were told that ordinary prophets received visions and dreams. Moses held a different place. He was faithful in all God's household, and God spoke with him directly and clearly, rather than through riddles. Aaron and Miriam had not been afraid to speak against him. The cloud lifted from the tent, and Miriam's skin was diseased, white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw what had happened. He confessed that they had acted foolishly and sinned. He begged Moses not to let Miriam remain like a stillborn child whose flesh was already wasting away. Moses cried out to God to heal her. The answer required Miriam to be put outside the camp for 7 days. The whole nation waited. No one moved until she had been brought back. Then Israel traveled into the wilderness of Paran. From there, God commanded Moses to send men to explore Canaan. 1 leader was chosen from each tribe. Among them were Caleb from Judah and Hoshea from Ephraim, whom Moses called Joshua. Moses sent the 12 men north from the wilderness. They were to examine the land, its people, cities, soil, forests, and produce. He urged them to be courageous and bring back some of the fruit. It was the season when grapes were beginning to ripen. The men crossed the land as far as its northern reaches. In the south, they came to Hebron, where descendants of Anak lived. In the valley of Eshcol, they cut a branch bearing a cluster of grapes so large that 2 men carried it on a pole. They also brought pomegranates and figs. After 40 days, the explorers returned. They came before Moses, Aaron, and the entire community and displayed the fruit. The land did flow with milk and honey, they said. Then came the dividing word, nevertheless. The people living there were powerful. The cities were fortified and very large. The descendants of Anak were present. Amalekites occupied the south, while Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites lived in the hill country. Canaanites lived near the sea and along the Jordan. Caleb quieted the people. He urged Israel to go up at once and take possession. They were able to do it. But the other men said Israel could not attack. The inhabitants were stronger. Their report darkened as they repeated it through the camp. They called Canaan a land that devoured its inhabitants. They described the people as giants and said that they had felt like grasshoppers beside them. That night, the entire community cried aloud. The people complained against Moses and Aaron. They wished they had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. They asked why the Lord was bringing them into the land only to fall by the sword while their wives and children were taken. Then they proposed choosing a new leader and returning to Egypt. Moses and Aaron fell face down before the assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. They told the people that the land was exceedingly good. If the Lord was pleased with Israel, he would bring them into it. The people must not rebel, and they must not fear the inhabitants. The protection of those nations was gone, while the Lord was with Israel. The assembly talked of stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting before all the people. God asked how long Israel would treat him with contempt. How many signs would they witness without believing? Again came the offer Moses had heard after the golden calf. The nation could be struck down, and a greater people could come from Moses. Again, Moses interceded. He said the Egyptians would hear of Israel's destruction. They knew that God dwelt among this people, appeared in the cloud, and guided them by day and night. If Israel died in the wilderness, the nations of Canaan would say that God lacked the power to bring the people into the promised land. Moses appealed to the character proclaimed on Sinai, patient, abundant in faithful love, forgiving wrongdoing, yet not treating guilt as innocence. He asked for the people to be pardoned as they had been pardoned from Egypt until now. The people were pardoned. The nation would not be destroyed in that moment. But pardon did not erase the consequence of refusing the land. The adults who had witnessed God's glory in Egypt and the wilderness, yet repeatedly tested him and refused to listen, would not enter Canaan. Caleb, who had followed faithfully, would enter. Joshua would enter with him. The people had said their children would be taken as plunder. Instead, those children would be brought into the land their parents had rejected. Everyone counted from 20 years old and above who had complained would die in the wilderness. For 40 years, corresponding to the 40 days of exploration, Israel would bear the result of its rebellion until that generation had passed away. Then the 10 explorers who had spread the faithless report were struck by a plague and died. Only Joshua and Caleb remained alive from the 12. Moses told Israel what had been decided, and the people mourned bitterly. The next morning, some rose early and prepared to enter the hill country. They admitted they had sinned and announced that they would now go to the place God had promised. Moses warned them not to go. Their attempt would fail because the Lord was not with them. Amalekites and Canaanites waited ahead, and Israel had turned away from the Lord. The people went anyway. Moses did not move from the camp. The ark did not go with them. The Amalekites and Canaanites came down from the hills, attacked them, and drove them back as far as Hormah. Israel had first refused to advance when commanded. Then they advanced after being forbidden. The road into Canaan was closed, and Moses was left to lead a generation that had been delivered from Egypt but had chosen its grave in the wilderness. Yet even under that sentence, Israel was still addressed as a people who would one day live in the promised land. Instructions were given for the offerings they would present after entering it. Grain, oil, and wine would accompany sacrifices from their herds and flocks. The same requirements applied to native Israelites and to foreigners living among them. When the people ate the produce of the land, the first portion of their dough would be presented to the Lord. Laws also distinguished unintended wrongdoing from deliberate defiance. A community or individual who sinned unintentionally could bring an offering and receive forgiveness. But a person who acted openly against the command was rejecting the covenant itself. A specific case soon tested that distinction. While Israel was in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath. Those who discovered him brought him to Moses and Aaron. He was held in custody because the required judgment had not yet been stated. The answer came that the man must die. The assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him. The people were then commanded to attach tassels to the corners of their garments, with a blue cord in each tassel. The visible threads would remind them to follow the commands, rather than wandering after their own desires. Israel's future remained promised, but no one was to confuse that promise with freedom from obedience. The next rebellion did not begin with fear of Canaan. It began with a challenge to the structure of authority inside the camp. Korah, a Levite, formed a coalition with Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben, along with On, son of Peleth. They were joined by 250 recognized leaders of the community. They confronted Moses and Aaron and accused them of going too far. The entire assembly was holy, they argued, and the Lord was among all of them. Why then had Moses and Aaron raised themselves above the congregation? When Moses heard this, he fell face down. He proposed a test. The following morning, Korah and his supporters were to take censers, place fire and incense in them, and present themselves before the Lord. God would reveal whom he had chosen to come near. Then Moses turned the accusation back upon the Levites. They had already been separated from the other tribes and brought near to serve at the tabernacle. Was that not enough? Korah and his fellow Levites were now seeking the priesthood as well. Their complaint against Aaron was ultimately a complaint against the one who had assigned Aaron's office. Moses summoned Dathan and Abiram, but they refused to come. Their answer used the language of promise against Moses. They accused him of bringing them out of a land flowing with milk and honey, only to kill them in the wilderness. Egypt, in their telling, had become the good land, while Moses had failed to give them fields and vineyards. They asked whether he intended to blind the people to that failure. Moses became angry. He told God not to accept their offering. He had not taken so much as a donkey from them, and he had not harmed any of them. The next day, Korah and the 250 leaders stood with their censers at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Korah gathered the wider community there against Moses and Aaron. The glory of the Lord appeared. Moses and Aaron were told to separate themselves so the assembly could be destroyed at once. They fell face down and pleaded for the people. They appealed to the God who gives breath to every living person. If one man sinned, they asked, should the entire community bear the anger? The assembly was ordered to move away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and touch nothing belonging to them. Moses went to Dathan and Abiram, and Israel's elders followed. The people withdrew from the rebels' tents. Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at their entrances with their wives and children. Moses then declared how the outcome would identify the source of his authority. If these men died in the ordinary course of life, Moses had not been sent. But if the ground opened and swallowed them alive, Israel would know that they had treated the Lord with contempt. As soon as Moses finished speaking, the ground split beneath them. The earth opened and swallowed their households and possessions. They disappeared into the ground, and the earth closed over them. The surrounding Israelites fled at their cries, afraid that the ground would swallow them too. Then fire came from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering incense. Their bronze censers had been presented before God and could no longer return to ordinary use. Eleazar collected them from the burned remains. The bronze was hammered into a covering for the altar, a permanent warning that no one outside Aaron's priestly line could offer incense there. The judgment was unmistakable. But the next day, the whole community accused Moses and Aaron of killing the Lord's people. As the assembly gathered against them, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the divine glory appeared. Moses and Aaron moved toward the tent. They were told to withdraw because destruction was about to fall upon the congregation. Once again, they fell face down. Moses recognized that the judgment had already begun. He told Aaron to take a censer, place fire from the altar in it, add incense, and hurry into the assembly to make atonement. Aaron ran into the crowd. People were already dying. He stood between the dead and the living, offering the incense, and the plague stopped. 14,700 people died, in addition to those lost in Korah's rebellion. Aaron returned to Moses at the tent of meeting. The priesthood challenged, as an act of self-exaltation had just become the barrier between the living and the dead. One more sign was given to settle the question. Each tribal leader brought a staff bearing his name. Aaron's name was written on the staff of Levi. Moses placed all 12 staffs before the ark. By the next day, Aaron's staff had sprouted. It had produced buds, blossoms, and ripe almonds. Moses brought the staffs out so every tribal leader could see and retrieve his own. Aaron's staff was returned to the sanctuary and kept there as a warning against further rebellion. The people looked at the tabernacle with dread. They cried that anyone who approached it would die. The responsibilities surrounding the sanctuary were therefore stated again. Aaron and his sons bore responsibility for the priesthood and altar. The Levites assisted them in guarding and carrying the tabernacle, but could not perform priestly duties or approach the sacred furnishings directly. The priests and Levites would not receive a tribal territory like the other Israelites. Their support came from offerings and tithes. In turn, the Levites gave a portion of what they received. The arrangement placed service, provision, and accountability around the sanctuary. Nearness was a gift, but it was never possession. A further ritual addressed the uncleanness caused by death, something the wilderness generation would know repeatedly. A red cow without defect was taken outside the camp and burned under priestly supervision. Its ashes were preserved and mixed with water for purification. Anyone who touched a human corpse, entered a tent where someone had died, or came into contact with a grave required cleansing before returning fully to the camp's sacred life. The ritual did not prevent death. It allowed a community surrounded by it to keep approaching the sanctuary without carrying its defilement into the center. The account then passes over the long years of wandering and returns to the people in the wilderness of Zin at Kadesh in the first month. There Miriam died and was buried. No extended farewell is recorded, for the woman who had watched over Moses at the Nile, led Israel's women after the sea, challenged her brother, and been restored after 7 days outside the camp. Her death is stated in a single line. Then the community discovered that there was no water. The people gathered against Moses and Aaron. They argued with Moses and said they wished they had died when their fellow Israelites fell before the Lord. They asked why God's assembly had been brought into the wilderness to die with its livestock. They asked why Moses had led them out of Egypt to this barren place where there was no grain, figs, vines, pomegranates, or water. The complaint echoed an earlier generation, but now Moses was standing among the children who had inherited the journey. Moses and Aaron left the assembly and went to the entrance of the tent of meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Moses was told to take the staff, gather the assembly with Aaron, and speak to a rock before the people. The rock would give water, providing enough for both the community and its animals. Moses took the staff from before the Lord and assembled the people in front of the rock. He called them rebels. Then he asked whether he and Aaron had to bring water out of the rock for them. Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with the staff. Water poured out in abundance, and the people and their livestock drank. The need was answered. But Moses had not done what he was told. He had been commanded to speak to the rock before Israel and thereby uphold God as holy. Instead, he had struck it and spoken as though the act belonged to him and Aaron. God told both brothers that because they had not trusted him enough to honor him as holy before the Israelites, they would not bring the assembly into the promised land. The place was called the waters of Meribah because Israel had quarreled there and God had shown his holiness among them. Moses had interceded when Israel made the calf. He had stood between the people and destruction after the spies. He had watched Aaron stand between the living and the dead during the plague. Now the judgment entered his own future. Water flowed from the rock, but the man who had led Israel to it had been told that he would die before the journey crossed into the land. The sentence did not stop the march. From Kadesh, Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom. They addressed Edom as Israel's brother and summarized the road that had brought the people to his border, the hardship in Egypt, the years of slavery, the cry for help, and the deliverance that followed. Israel was now camped at the edge of Edomite territory and requested permission to pass through. The messengers promised that the people would not cross fields or vineyards. They would not drink from Edom's wells. They would remain on the king's highway and continue straight through without turning aside. Edom refused. The king warned that if Israel entered his territory, he would come out with the sword. Israel sent another message. The people would stay on the main road, and if they or their livestock drank any water, they would pay for it. They wanted only to pass through on foot. Edom answered that they could not pass. Then a large Edomite force came out to block the road. Israel did not attack. The nation turned away and began the longer route around the territory. The refusal carried a practical consequence. The people were near the land, but the direct road north had closed. Every detour placed more wilderness in front of a generation already exhausted by it. Israel traveled from Kadesh to Mount Hor, near the border of Edom. There, God told Moses and Aaron that Aaron's life had reached its end. He would not enter the promised land because he had joined Moses in rebellion at the waters of Meribah. Moses was commanded to take Aaron and Eleazar up the mountain. Before Aaron died, his priestly garments were to be removed and placed upon his son. The three men climbed Mount Hor in sight of the community. At the summit, Moses removed Aaron's garments and clothed Eleazar in them. The office passed from father to son before Aaron's death, ensuring that Israel would not be left without a high priest. Then Aaron died on the mountain. Moses and Eleazar descended without him. When the community understood that Aaron was dead, the entire nation mourned for 30 days. Aaron had stood beside Moses before Pharaoh. His staff had struck the Nile. His voice had carried Moses' words. He had helped hold Moses' hands over the battle with Amalek. He had failed at the golden calf, been consecrated as high priest, watched 2 sons die at the altar, and later stood with incense between the living and the dead. Now Moses continued with Eleazar, wearing Aaron's garments beside him. News of Israel's movement reached the Canaanite king of Arad in the south. He attacked and took some Israelites captive. Israel made a vow. If God delivered this people into their hands, they would devote the enemy's cities to destruction. The Canaanites were given over to them, and Israel destroyed the cities. The place was called Hormah. That name had already been associated with the failed invasion after the spies' report. Then Israel had attacked without Moses, without the ark, and without divine approval. Now an enemy had attacked Israel. The people had appealed to God, and the outcome was reversed. Yet victory did not remove the strain of the road. Israel set out from Mount Hor toward the Red Sea to go around Edom. As the route lengthened, the people became impatient. They spoke against God and Moses. Why had they been brought out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There was no bread, no water, and they detested the miserable food available to them. The manna that had sustained Israel since the early journey from Egypt was now treated with contempt. Venomous snakes entered the camp. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The survivors came to Moses and confessed that they had sinned by speaking against the Lord and against him. They asked Moses to pray for the snakes to be taken away. Moses prayed. He was told to make the image of a snake and place it on a pole. Anyone who had been bitten could look at it and live. Moses made a bronze snake and raised it where the people could see. When a bitten person looked at the bronze snake, that person survived. The object had no power apart from the instruction attached to it. The people who had challenged the way God sustained them were now required to trust a prescribed act as simple as looking upward. From there, Israel continued by stages. The people camped at Oboth, then at Iye-Abarim in the wilderness east of Moab. They moved through the valley of Zered and camped beyond the Arnon River. The Arnon marked a political boundary. Moab lay on one side and Amorite territory on the other. Israel was leaving the region shaped by Edom's refusal and moving toward kingdoms that controlled the approaches east of the Jordan. The route was remembered through sayings about rivers, ravines, and settlements along the border. Each stage carried the people farther north and closer to the land they had once refused to enter. At Beer, the Lord told Moses to gather the people so water could be provided. Israel sang again, this time not beside a sea filled with Pharaoh's army, but beside a well in contested country. The people called for the well to spring up, remembering that leaders and nobles had opened it with staffs. The song was brief, but its setting mattered. The generation was moving. The leaders gathered the people, water was given, and the march continued through Mattanah, Nahaliel, Bamoth, and the valley near the heights of Pisgah. Israel had not entered Canaan from the south. Now the nation approached from the east, where Amorite kings controlled substantial territory. Moses sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, requesting passage. The terms echoed the appeal made to Edom. Israel would not turn into fields or vineyards. They would not drink water from wells. They would remain on the king's highway until they had passed through Sihon's land. Sihon refused to permit the crossing, but unlike Edom, he did not simply block the border. He gathered his army, marched into the wilderness, and attacked Israel at Jahaz. Israel fought back and defeated him. The people took possession of the Amorite territory from the Arnon in the south to the Jabbok in the north, stopping at the strong border of the Ammonites. They occupied the cities, including Heshbon, Sihon's capital. Heshbon had itself been taken earlier from a Moabite king. A victory song preserved the rise of Sihon's city and the devastation his forces had once brought upon Moab. Now the kingdom celebrated in that song belonged to Israel. The result changed the nature of the journey. Until this point, Israel had moved primarily as a people seeking passage. Edom had refused, and Israel had turned aside. Sihon refused and attacked, but after his defeat, Israel occupied his towns and land. For the first time, the people held a broad, defensible territory of their own east of the Jordan. Moses sent men to explore Jazer. Israel captured its surrounding settlements and drove out the Amorites there. Then the people turned north along the road toward Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, came out with his entire army and confronted them at Edrei. God told Moses not to fear him. Og, his people and his land had been handed over to Israel. The same judgment that had fallen upon Sihon would fall upon Bashan. Israel struck Og and his army. The victory was complete. No survivor remained to continue the resistance, and Israel took possession of the territory. The two kingdoms of Sihon and Og had controlled the highlands and approaches east of the Jordan. Both had now fallen. These victories did not cancel the sentence over the wilderness generation. They did not restore Aaron, reopen Moses' future, or place Israel across the Jordan, but they proved that the years of wandering had not left the nation powerless. A people once trapped between Pharaoh and the sea now held the lands of two defeated kings. Moses had led them around Edom through the loss of Aaron, beyond another outbreak of rebellion, and into their first lasting possession. The geography of the story had changed. Israel was no longer wandering without a foothold. The people were standing east of Canaan, close enough for the kingdoms along the Jordan to understand that they were coming. Across Israel's path lay Moab, and Moab was watching. Balak, the king of Moab, had seen what Israel did to the Amorites. The Moabites were terrified by the size of the nation camped near them. Their elders described Israel as an ox consuming the grass around it. Balak did not begin by sending an army. He sent messengers far to the northeast, to a man named Balaam, who had a reputation for effective blessing and cursing. The delegation carried payment for divination. They told Balaam that a people had come out of Egypt and now covered the land near Moab. Balak wanted Balaam to curse them so he could defeat and drive them away. Balaam told the messengers to remain overnight while he sought an answer from God. That night, God asked Balaam who the men were. Balaam explained their request. He was told not to go with them and not to curse Israel, because Israel was blessed. In the morning, Balaam sent Balak's officials home. Balak responded by sending a second delegation, larger and more distinguished than the first. They promised Balaam great honor and offered to do whatever he asked if he would come and curse Israel. Balaam answered that even if Balak gave him a palace filled with silver and gold, he could not go beyond the command of the Lord his God. Still, he invited the officials to stay while he sought another answer. God told Balaam that if the men had come to summon him, he could go, but he must do only what God commanded. Balaam rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. God's anger burned as he traveled, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road as his adversary. Balaam did not see the angel. His donkey did. The animal saw a drawn sword blocking the road and turned into a field. Balaam struck the donkey and forced it back. The angel moved to a narrow path between vineyard walls. The donkey pressed against one wall, crushing Balaam's foot. He struck her again. The angel moved farther ahead to a place so narrow that there was no room to turn. The donkey saw the danger and lay down beneath Balaam. Balaam became furious and struck her with his staff. Then the donkey spoke. She asked what she had done to deserve 3 beatings. Balaam answered that she had made a fool of him. If he had a sword, he said, he would kill her. The donkey reminded Balaam that she had carried him throughout his life. Had she ever behaved this way before? He admitted that she had not. Then Balaam's eyes were opened, and he saw the angel standing in the road with the sword drawn. He bowed face down. The angel asked why Balaam had beaten the animal 3 times. The donkey had seen the danger and turned away. If she had continued, Balaam would have been killed and the donkey spared. Balaam confessed that he had sinned. He offered to turn back. The angel allowed him to continue, but warned him to speak only the word he was given. Balak went out to meet Balaam near Moab's northern border. He demanded to know why Balaam had not come when first summoned. Did Balaam think the king could not reward him? Balaam answered that he had arrived, but he had no independent power to say whatever he wanted. He could speak only the words placed in his mouth. Balak brought him to a town where sacrifices were offered, then took him to a height from which he could see part of Israel's camp. Balaam ordered 7 altars to be built. A bull and a ram were offered on each one. Then Balaam went apart to seek a word. When he returned, Balak and Moab's officials were waiting beside the offerings. Balaam began the curse Balak had purchased, but the words became a blessing. He asked how he could curse those whom God had not cursed. From the heights, he saw a people living separately among the nations. Israel's numbers were beyond easy counting. Balaam ended by asking to die the death of the upright and share their final destiny. Balak was outraged. He had brought Balaam to curse his enemies, and Balaam had blessed them. Balaam reminded him that he had to speak what he was given. Balak moved him to another location where he could see a different portion of the camp. Again, 7 altars were built, and 7 bulls and 7 rams were offered. The second message declared that God was not a man who lied or changed his word. A blessing had been given, and Balaam could not reverse it. No curse or divination could overcome Israel while their God was with them. The power that had brought them from Egypt was compared to the strength of a wild ox. The people would rise like a lion and would not rest until victory was consumed. Balak told Balaam that if he could not curse Israel, he should at least stop blessing them. Balaam answered that he had warned the king from the beginning. He must do what God said. Balak tried a third location. He took Balaam to the top of Peor, overlooking the wilderness. 7 more altars were built, and the offerings were repeated. This time, Balaam did not seek omens as before. He looked toward the wilderness and saw Israel arranged by tribes. The Spirit of God came upon him. He spoke of Israel's tents spread out like valleys and gardens beside a river. He described abundance, royal power, and victory over enemies. He repeated the covenant pattern that had followed Israel from its ancestors. Those who blessed the people would be blessed, and those who cursed them would be cursed. Balak struck his hands together in anger. He had summoned Balaam to curse his enemies, and Balaam had blessed them 3 times. The king ordered him to leave without the promised honor. Balaam replied that he had already told Balak's messengers that no amount of silver or gold would allow him to go beyond God's command. Before leaving, he announced what Israel would do in days to come. He spoke of a ruler rising from Israel, pictured as a star and a scepter. Moab and Edom would fall under this power. Amalek, though prominent among nations, would be destroyed. Other peoples would also face conquest, captivity, and upheaval. Then Balaam departed, and Balak went his own way. Moab had failed to place a curse upon Israel, but at Peor, Israel brought disaster upon itself. Israelite men entered sexual relationships with Moabite women, who invited them to sacrifices for their gods. The men ate the sacrificial meals and bowed in worship. Israel joined itself to the Baal of Peor. God's anger burned against the nation. Moses ordered Israel's judges to execute those under their authority who had attached themselves to Baal. As the community wept at the entrance to the tent of meeting, an Israelite man openly brought a Midianite woman into the camp before Moses and the assembly. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, saw them. He left the assembly, took a spear, followed the pair into the man's tent, and drove the weapon through both of them. The plague stopped. 24,000 Israelites had died. Phinehas's action turned back further judgment because he had acted with zeal for the holiness violated in the camp. He received a covenant of peace and a lasting priestly promise for his family. The dead were identified. The Israelite man was Zimri, a leader from the tribe of Simeon. The Midianite woman was Cosbi, daughter of a tribal chief. Israel was commanded to treat the Midianites as enemies because of their hostility and deception at Peor. After the plague, Moses and Eleazar took another census. The men 20 years old and above were counted by tribe, both for military service and for the future distribution of land. Larger tribes would receive larger inheritances and smaller tribes smaller inheritances, while location would be decided by lot. The total was 601,730. The number stood close to the census taken at Sinai, but these were not the same men. Among those now counted, only Joshua and Caleb remained from the adults listed in the earlier census. The judgment pronounced after the spies' report had been fulfilled. The others had died in the wilderness. The Levites were counted separately from 1 month old and above. They numbered 23,000 and would receive no ordinary tribal territory. Within the census record, the deaths of Dathan and Abiram and the destruction of Korah's company were remembered. But Korah's sons had not died. A family line had survived the rebellion associated with its name. Another family faced a different question of survival. Zelophehad, a man of Manasseh's tribe, had died without a son. His 5 daughters, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, came before Moses, Eleazar, the leaders, and the assembly at the entrance to the tent. They explained that their father had died in the wilderness, but he had not belonged to Korah's coalition. He had died for his own sin. Why should their father's name disappear from his clan simply because he had no son? They asked to receive property among their father's relatives. Moses brought their case before God. The daughters were right. They were to receive their father's inheritance. Their case also established a wider law. If a man died without a son, his inheritance passed to his daughter. If he had no daughter, it moved through his brothers, his father's brothers, or the nearest relative in his clan. The land Israel had not yet entered was already requiring decisions about how families would live upon it. Then God told Moses to climb the mountain range east of the Jordan and look toward the promised land. After seeing it, Moses would die as Aaron had died. Neither brother would enter because both had rebelled at Meribah and failed to uphold God's holiness before the people. Moses did not ask for the sentence to be removed. He asked for a leader. He appealed to the God who gives breath to all people to appoint someone over the community, someone who would go out and come in before them and lead them out and bring them home. Israel must not become like sheep without a shepherd. The answer was Joshua, a man in whom the Spirit was present. Moses was to place his hand upon him and bring him before Eleazar and the entire assembly. There Joshua would be publicly commissioned and given a share of Moses' authority so the people would obey him. Joshua would also stand before Eleazar, who would seek direction through the priestly means of decision. At that command, Joshua and the entire community would go out and come in. Moses did exactly as he was told. He brought Joshua before Eleazar and the assembly, laid his hands upon him, and commissioned him in the sight of Israel. The generation that had left Egypt was gone. The generation that would approach Canaan had been counted. A ruling protected its inheritance, and a successor now stood beside Moses. But Moses' work was not finished. Before Joshua could lead Israel across the Jordan, Moses still had a war to command, promises between tribes to secure, and a nation's life in the land to place in order. He began by fixing Israel's worship to the rhythm of time. Offerings were assigned for every day, every Sabbath, and the beginning of every month. Additional sacrifices marked Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Day of Trumpet Blasts, the Day of Atonement, and the week-long Feast of Shelters. The schedule was detailed because worship in the land would not depend upon a sudden crisis or a leader's presence. Morning and evening, week after week, season after season, Israel's calendar would remember the relationship established at Sinai. Moses also gave rulings concerning vows. A man who made a vow was bound by his word. A young woman living in her father's household could have a vow confirmed or cancelled by her father when he heard it. A married woman's husband could likewise confirm or cancel a vow when it became known to him. Widows and divorced women were responsible for their own vows. Silence upon hearing a vow allowed it to stand. A husband who tried to cancel it only after delay bore the guilt involved. Commitments made before God were not to be manipulated after the fact. Then Moses received the command for one final military action before his death. Israel was to take vengeance on Midian for the attack carried out through Peor. 1,000 armed men were chosen from each tribe, 12,000 in all. Phinehas went with them, carrying sacred objects and the trumpets used to signal battle. Israel defeated the Midianite forces. 5 Midianite kings were killed: Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba. Balaam was also killed with the sword. The man whom Balak had hired to curse Israel had been unable to speak the curse. But Moses now identified Balaam's counsel as the means by which Midianite women had drawn Israel into unfaithfulness at Peor. The Israelite force took Midianite women and children captive and seized livestock and property. They burned the towns and camps, then brought the captives and spoil to Moses, Eleazar, and the community on the plains of Moab. Moses became angry with the officers because they had allowed all the women to live. He connected those women directly to the Peor disaster. His order was severe. Every male child was to be killed, along with every woman who had slept with a man. The young girls who had not were spared. The account gives no softer version of the command. The campaign ended not only in battlefield defeat, but in the destruction of Midianite households associated with the attack upon Israel. Anyone who had killed or touched a dead body had to remain outside the camp for 7 days and undergo purification on the 3rd and 7th days. Captives, clothing, leather, woven goods, and wooden objects also required cleansing. Eleazar instructed the soldiers concerning metals taken in war. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, and lead could pass through fire and then be purified with cleansing water. Anything unable to endure fire was washed. After the required purification, the soldiers could return to the camp. The captured property was divided into 2 equal portions, one for the soldiers who had fought and one for the rest of the community. A levy from the soldiers' portion went to Eleazar for the sanctuary. A larger levy from the community's half went to the Levites, who served the tabernacle. The commanders then reported something extraordinary. After counting the soldiers under their authority, they found that not one Israelite fighter was missing. They brought gold objects taken in the campaign, armlets, bracelets, rings, earrings, and necklaces, and presented them before the Lord as an offering and atonement. Moses and Eleazar received the gold and placed it at the tent of meeting as a memorial. With Midian defeated, another question emerged from the territory Israel had already taken. The tribes of Reuben and Gad owned very large herds. They looked at the lands of Jazer and Gilead and saw that the region was well suited for livestock. Their leaders came to Moses, Eleazar, and the tribal chiefs. They listed the captured towns and asked to receive that country as their inheritance. They did not want to cross the Jordan and settle in Canaan. Moses heard a dangerous echo. He asked whether their fellow Israelites were expected to go to war while they remained behind. Their refusal to cross would discourage the rest of the nation, just as the spies had discouraged their parents at Kadesh. Moses recalled the full consequence of that earlier refusal. The explorers had seen the land and turned Israel's heart away from entering it. God's anger had followed, and the adult generation had wandered until it died. Now, Moses warned, Reuben and Gad were in danger of rising in their parents' place and bringing another destructive judgment upon Israel. The tribal leaders offered a different arrangement. They would build pens for their livestock and fortified towns for their wives and children. Then their fighting men would cross the Jordan armed and lead the advance until every tribe had received its inheritance. They would not return to their homes until the campaign was complete. Their own inheritance would remain east of the Jordan. Moses accepted the proposal under those conditions. If their armed men crossed before the Lord and remained until the land was subdued, they could return without guilt and possess Gilead. But if they failed, their sin would find them, and they would receive land across the Jordan with the other tribes instead. The agreement was stated publicly before Eleazar, Joshua, and the family leaders, so it would remain enforceable after Moses was gone. Reuben and Gad accepted the terms. They rebuilt towns for their families and enclosures for their animals. Part of the tribe of Manasseh also received territory east of the Jordan after its clans captured Amorite settlements. The final eastern allocation therefore belonged to Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Moses then recorded the stages of Israel's entire journey as they had unfolded under divine direction. The route began at Ramesses. Israel had marched out the day after Passover in full view of the Egyptians, while Egypt was burying the firstborn struck in the final plague. The record followed the people through Succoth, Etham, the crossing near the sea, Marah, Elim, the wilderness camps, Sinai, the stations of wandering, Kadesh, and Mount Hor. It noted that Aaron had climbed Mount Hor and died there in the 40th year after the Exodus, at the age of 123. It also remembered when the Canaanite king of Arad heard that Israel was approaching. The itinerary continued around Edom and Moab until Israel reached the plains beside the Jordan across from Jericho. The list did not expand the years of wandering into imagined events. It preserved the succession of places. Some had witnessed rescue, some complaint, some death, and some nothing more than arrival and departure. On the plains of Moab, Israel received commands for taking possession of Canaan. The people were to drive out the inhabitants, destroy carved images and cast idols, and demolish pagan high places. The land would then be distributed by lot, according to tribal size. But Israel was warned not to leave hostile communities embedded among them. Those allowed to remain would become like barbs in their eyes and thorns in their sides, creating continuing conflict. Refusal to carry out the judgment would turn the threatened consequence back upon Israel itself. The borders of the inheritance were then defined. The southern boundary curved from the wilderness of Zin toward the Mediterranean. The western boundary was the Mediterranean coast. The northern line ran from the sea through designated mountains and settlements, while the eastern boundary descended toward the Sea of Galilee and followed the Jordan to the Dead Sea. Eleazar and Joshua would oversee the distribution, assisted by one leader from each of the tribes receiving land in Canaan. The Levites, who had no ordinary tribal territory, were to receive 48 towns with surrounding pasture land. These towns would be distributed among the other tribes in proportion to the size of each inheritance. 6 of the Levitical towns would serve as cities of refuge. 3 would stand east of the Jordan, and 3 within Canaan. Their purpose was to distinguish murder from an accidental killing. A person who killed someone without hostility could flee from the avenger of blood and receive a hearing before the community. Intentional murder, established through evidence, required death. One witness alone was not enough to impose that sentence. No payment could substitute for the life of a convicted murderer. A person judged responsible for an accidental death had to remain in the city of refuge. If the avenger found that person outside its boundary, the protection no longer applied. After the death of the high priest, the person could return home. The law recognized that bloodshed polluted the land. The place where God would dwell among Israel could not treat innocent blood as a private matter or erase murder through payment. Finally, the family leaders of Manasseh returned to the inheritance question raised by Zelophehad's daughters. The daughters had been granted their father's property, but if they married men from another tribe, their land would eventually pass into that tribe. Over time, the permanent boundaries established by inheritance could be altered. Moses ruled that the concern was valid. The daughters were free to marry whomever they chose within their father's tribal clan. This would preserve both their right to inherit and Manasseh's territorial share. Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah obeyed. They married sons of their father's brothers, keeping the inheritance within the clan. That ruling closed the body of commands given through Moses on the plains of Moab. The route had been recorded from Egypt to the Jordan. The eastern settlements had been conditioned upon loyalty to the wider nation. Canaan's borders had been named, its distribution assigned, and laws established for worship, vows, land, refuge, bloodshed, and inheritance. Moses had brought Israel as far as he was permitted to go. Now, with the river and Jericho before them, he had to tell the new generation what their parents' journey meant and why possessing the land would depend upon remembering it. Moses addressed them in the 40th year after the Exodus on the first day of the 11th month. He spoke east of the Jordan after the defeats of Sihon and Og. His task was no longer to guide the camp toward another wilderness station. He began explaining the law to the people who would enter the land. He returned first to Horeb. God had told Israel that they had remained at the mountain long enough. The time had come to move toward the hill country of Canaan and take the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. By then, Israel had become too numerous for Moses to carry alone. He had appointed wise and respected leaders as judges, instructing them to hear cases fairly. They were not to favor the powerful or fear any person because judgment belonged to God. Difficult cases could still be brought to Moses. From Horeb, the nation had crossed the great and fearful wilderness and reached Kadesh Barnea. The promised land stood before them. Moses had told the people not to be afraid. They had asked to send explorers ahead. The proposal had seemed good to Moses, and the 12 men had gone. The fruit they brought back confirmed that the land was good, yet the people refused to enter. In their tents, they accused God of hating them and bringing them out of Egypt, only to hand them over to the Amorites. Moses had told them not to be terrified. The God who fought for them in Egypt would fight for them again. In the wilderness, they had been carried as a father carries a son. The cloud and fire had gone ahead, choosing their camps and showing the road. They had still refused to trust. That generation was sentenced to die outside the land. Caleb and Joshua would enter. The children whom their parents said would become captives would receive the inheritance. When the people tried to reverse the decision and attack, they went without divine support and were driven back. Israel then remained in the region for many days before turning toward the wilderness. Moses carried the retelling through the long route around Edom. Israel had been forbidden to provoke the descendants of Esau. Because their land had been given to them, food and water had to be purchased rather than seized. The same restraint applied to Moab and Ammon. Israel was not given their territories. Those nations possessed lands assigned to the descendants of Lot. For 38 years after leaving Kadesh, the fighting generation passed away, just as the sentence had declared. Only then did the road turn toward the Amorite kingdoms. Moses recalled the peaceful offer sent to Sihon. Israel would remain on the road, buy food and water, and cross the territory without taking anything. Sihon refused and came out to fight. God gave Israel the victory, and the people occupied his towns. Og of Bashan then marched against them and was also defeated. His fortified cities and settlements fell, and his territory was divided. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh received those lands, but their warriors remained obligated to cross the Jordan and fight beside the other tribes. Moses reminded Joshua of what he had seen. The same power that defeated Sihon and Og would act against the kingdoms west of the river. Joshua was not to fear them. Then Moses spoke of his own appeal. He had pleaded for permission to cross the Jordan and see the good land, its hill country and Lebanon. The answer was no. Moses was told not to raise the matter again. He could climb Pisgah and look in every direction, but he would not cross. Joshua would lead the people. Moses was to strengthen and encourage him because Joshua would distribute the inheritance. With that boundary stated, Moses turned from the route behind them to the life ahead. Israel must listen to the commands and follow them. They were not to add to the law or subtract from it. The people had seen what happened at Baal Peor. Those who joined themselves to that worship died, while those who remained faithful were alive at the Jordan. Obedience would display wisdom before surrounding nations. Other peoples would see a nation whose God was near when called upon, and whose laws ordered life with justice. But Israel had to guard its memory. The people were not to forget what they had seen or allow it to disappear from their hearts. They had to teach it to their children and grandchildren. At Horeb, Israel had heard a voice from the fire, but had seen no form. Therefore, the people must not create an image and identify it with God, whether shaped like a man, woman, animal, bird, creature of the ground, or fish. They were also warned not to look at the sun, moon, and stars and bow to them. Moses knew where idolatry would lead. He called heaven and earth as witnesses that if Israel corrupted itself in the land, the people would not remain there. They would be scattered among nations and reduced in number. Yet exile would not erase the covenant. If they sought God with their whole heart, they would find him. He would not forget the promise sworn to their ancestors. Moses asked them to consider how extraordinary their history was. Had any other people heard God speak from fire and lived? Had any God entered another nation to take a people for himself through trials, signs, war, and mighty acts like those Israel saw in Egypt? These events had shown them that the Lord alone was God. 3 cities east of the Jordan were then designated as places of refuge for those responsible for accidental deaths. Even before the western land was entered, the principles of justice were being placed upon the territory already held. Moses repeated the covenant commands first heard at Horeb. Israel was to have no other gods, make no idol, and not misuse the divine name. The Sabbath was to be kept, and its rest extended to children, servants, foreigners, and animals. This time, the Sabbath command directly recalled slavery. Israel must give rest, because they themselves had once been servants in Egypt and had been brought out by a mighty hand. Parents were to be honored. Murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and coveting were forbidden. Moses reminded the people that their parents had feared the voice from the fire. The tribal leaders had asked Moses to stand between them and God. They promised to listen to whatever he received. Their request was accepted, and Moses became the mediator who heard the commands and taught them to Israel. Now those words had to outlive him. Moses called Israel to hear that the Lord alone was their God. They were to love him with the whole heart, life, and strength. The commands were to remain upon their hearts and be taught carefully to their children. Families were to speak of them at home, on the road, at night, and in the morning. The words were to mark their hands, their vision, their doorframes, and their gates. This constant remembrance was necessary because the land would confront Israel with a new kind of danger. They would inherit cities they had not built, houses filled with goods they had not provided, wells they had not dug, and orchards they had not planted. After eating until satisfied, they could forget the God who brought them from slavery. Prosperity could accomplish what Pharaoh and the wilderness had failed to do: turn Israel away from the one who delivered them. They were not to test God, as they had at Massa. When children asked about the laws, parents were to begin with the story of rescue. Israel had been Pharaoh's slave, and the Lord had brought the people out to give them the promised land. Obedience belonged inside that relationship. Moses also warned them against making treaties with the nations of Canaan or joining their worship through marriage. Their altars and sacred objects were to be destroyed. Israel's election was not based on size. They had been among the smallest peoples. They were chosen because of divine love and the promise made to their ancestors. That relationship carried both faithful commitment and judgment. Israel could not preserve idols for the value of their silver and gold. What appeared profitable would become a snare. The 40 years in the wilderness had exposed what was in the people's hearts. Hunger had taught them that life depended upon more than bread. Clothing had not worn out, and feet had not swollen during the long road. Moses described the wilderness discipline as that of a father correcting a son. Canaan, by contrast, was a land of streams and springs, wheat and barley, vines, figs, pomegranates, olive oil and honey. It contained stone, timber and metal. Israel would eat without scarcity, but satisfaction carried its own command. Remember, when houses, herds, silver and gold multiplied, the people must not credit their own power for their wealth. The ability to prosper had been given to establish the covenant promise. They were not entering because of their own righteousness. The nations of Canaan had filled their land with wrongdoing, but Israel had repeatedly shown its own stubbornness. Moses recalled the golden calf when he shattered the tablets and remained before God for 40 days and nights, pleading against Israel's destruction. He recalled the fire at Taberah, the testing at Massah, the graves of craving, and the rebellion at Kadesh. From the day Moses knew them, the people had resisted. The new tablets and the ark preserved the covenant after the calf. The tribe of Levi had been set apart to carry the ark, serve before God, and bless in his name. Moses had interceded, and the command to continue toward the land had remained. So what was required now? Israel was to fear God, walk in his ways, love and serve him, and keep the commands given for their good. They were to remove the stubbornness from their hearts. The God they worshipped showed no partiality and accepted no bribe. He defended the fatherless and widow and loved the foreign resident, providing food and clothing. Israel must love the foreigner because Israel had been foreign in Egypt. 70 members of Jacob's household had gone down there. Now Israel had become as numerous as the stars. The people standing before Moses had seen the discipline, signs and power that brought them to this boundary. Obedience would strengthen them to cross and remain in the land. Unlike Egypt, where fields depended upon laborious irrigation, Canaan depended upon rain from the sky. Its abundance could not be separated from the God who sent that rain. If Israel loved and served faithfully, the rains would come in season. If the people turned toward other gods, the sky would close and the land would fail. Again, Moses told them to place the words upon their hearts and teach them to their children. A blessing and a curse now stood before Israel. The blessing belonged to obedience. The curse followed departure from the commanded way. When they crossed the Jordan, those alternatives would be proclaimed from Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. But first, Moses had to show them what obedience would require when worship, courts, kings, war, debt, family, harvest, and daily work became the ordinary life of a nation in the land. The first concern was worship. Israel was to destroy the Canaanite shrines found on mountains, hills, and beneath spreading trees. Their altars, sacred pillars, and carved images were to be demolished. Israel could not simply transfer the name of its God onto the practices of the land. A place would be chosen where sacrifices, tithes, vows, and firstborn offerings were brought. Families would eat there in celebration, including the Levites who had no territorial inheritance of their own. Ordinary meat could be slaughtered within Israel's towns, but blood was not to be consumed. It represented life and had to be poured upon the ground. The people were warned not to investigate how the nations worshipped and then imitate them. Canaanite worship had included acts that Israel was forbidden to reproduce, even the burning of sons and daughters. No prophet could overturn exclusive loyalty to God. If a person performed a sign and then urged Israel to serve other gods, the successful sign did not validate the message. The prophet was testing whether the people would remain faithful. The same applied when enticement came privately from a brother, child, spouse, or closest friend. Personal affection could not transform idolatry into innocence. If an entire town was accused of abandoning the covenant, the report had to be investigated carefully. If established as true, the apostate city faced complete destruction. Serious judgment required serious inquiry. Israel's distinct life also reached the dinner table. Animals were classified as clean or unclean, preserving boundaries in daily eating. The people were forbidden to cut themselves or shave their foreheads for the dead, practices belonging to surrounding nations. Each year, a tenth of the harvest was brought to the chosen place and eaten before God. If the distance was too great to transport the produce, it could be exchanged for silver and purchased again at the sanctuary. Every third year, the tithe remained in local towns to feed Levites, foreign residents, orphans, and widows. The seventh year brought cancellation of debts among Israelites. No lender was to refuse a poor person because the release year was near. The command was to give freely and open the hand. Moses did not tell Israel that poverty would never exist. He told them that the poor would remain among them, and therefore generosity must remain as well. Hebrew servants were released in the seventh year and could not be sent away empty-handed. They were to receive animals, grain, and wine in proportion to the prosperity God had given the household. Israel was to remember slavery in Egypt. Freedom received had to shape freedom given. If a servant chose to remain permanently because of love for the household and security there, the decision was marked publicly at the door. Firstborn animals belonged to God. They were not to be used for ordinary labor or profit. If an animal had a serious defect, it could be eaten at home rather than sacrificed. The annual festivals gathered Israel's history, harvest, and household around worship. Passover remembered the night of departure from Egypt. The Feast of Weeks marked the harvest and required generosity in proportion to what had been received. The Feast of Shelters became a week of rejoicing after produce had been gathered. Sons, daughters, servants, Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows were included. 3 times each year, Israel's men appeared before God, and no one came empty-handed. Justice required local structure. Judges and officials were to be appointed throughout the towns. They must not distort cases, show partiality, or accept bribes. No sacred pole or unauthorized pillar could be placed beside the altar. A defective animal could not be offered. An accusation of idolatry required 2 or 3 witnesses. No person could be executed on the word of a single witness. Those who testified had to take responsibility for the judgment by acting first when the sentence was carried out. Difficult cases could be taken to the central place and decided by the Levitical priests and the judge serving at that time. Their ruling was binding. Public law could not function if every losing party simply rejected lawful judgment. Moses anticipated that Israel would eventually ask for a king like the surrounding nations. The king had to be an Israelite chosen under divine authority. He could not multiply horses, send the people back toward Egypt to acquire them, collect many wives, or accumulate excessive silver and gold. He was to write for himself a copy of the law, keep it near, and read it throughout his life. The king remained under the covenant. Power did not place him above his fellow Israelites or above the commands. Priests and Levites would live from the offerings because they had no ordinary share of land. A Levite arriving from another town could serve at the chosen sanctuary and receive an equal portion. Israel was forbidden to adopt the occult practices of Canaan. No one was to sacrifice a child, practice sorcery, interpret omens, cast spells, consult the dead, or seek guidance from mediums. The people had once asked not to hear the divine voice from the fire. Therefore God would raise up a prophet from among them, like Moses, whose words they must hear. But prophets were accountable. Anyone speaking presumptuously in God's name or speaking for other gods faced death. If a prediction failed, the message had not come from God, and Israel did not need to fear the speaker. The cities of refuge protected a person who caused an accidental death without prior hatred. Roads to those cities had to be maintained so the accused could reach safety before trial. Deliberate murder received no such protection. Property boundaries were not to be moved. A single witness could not establish guilt in any offense. When a witness was accused of lying, judges had to investigate. A malicious witness received the penalty intended for the innocent person. Before battle, a priest addressed the army. Israel was not to fear horses, chariots, or larger forces, because the God who brought them from Egypt went with them. Men who had built a house but not dedicated it, planted a vineyard but not enjoyed it, or become engaged but not married, could return home. Anyone too afraid to fight was also sent back so that fear would not spread through the ranks. Cities outside the designated Canaanite nations were first offered terms of peace. The nations within Canaan fell under a different judgment because their worship would teach Israel to repeat their practices. Even during a siege, fruit trees could not be destroyed merely to build military works. War did not erase the distinction between a combatant and the living resources that sustained the land. If a murder victim was found outside a town and the killer was unknown, nearby elders had to perform a public rite declaring that they had neither committed nor witnessed the crime. Unsolved bloodshed still demanded communal acknowledgement. A woman taken captive in war received a period to mourn before marriage. If the husband later rejected her, he could not sell her as a slave. A father could not deny the inheritance rights of his actual firstborn simply because he preferred another wife. A persistently rebellious son who rejected both parents and remained violent and destructive was brought before the town elders rather than punished through private rage. The public judgment was severe, but the accusation and sentence belonged before the community. A body hung after execution had to be removed before night. The land was not to remain defiled by public exposure of the dead. Lost livestock and property had to be returned. A person could not see a neighbor's animal collapse and ignore it. A protective wall was required around a flat roof so the household would not become responsible for someone falling. Commands concerning clothing, fields, animals, marriage, and sexual conduct guarded distinctions, households, and inheritance. Accusations against a bride required evidence. Adultery, rape, seduction, incest, and forbidden unions received distinct judgments rather than being treated as one undifferentiated offense. Some cases carried death. Others required marriage, compensation, exclusion, or protection for the injured party. The laws belonged to a world where a sexual offense could alter a woman's security, family standing, and future, and responsibility was placed upon the man who caused that harm. Admission to Israel's public assembly was also regulated. Certain neighboring peoples were excluded because of their hostility during the wilderness journey, while later generations of Edomites and Egyptians could be admitted. Edom was Israel's brother, and Israel had once lived as a foreign population in Egypt. Military camps had to remain clean. Human waste was buried outside because God moved among the troops. An escaped slave was not to be returned to the master from whom he had fled. The person could settle freely in an Israelite town and was not to be oppressed. Ritual prostitution was forbidden. Interest could not be charged to a fellow Israelite, though commercial lending to foreigners was treated differently. A vow was voluntary until made. Once spoken, it had to be fulfilled promptly. A hungry traveler could pluck grapes or heads of grain from a neighbor's field by hand, but could not harvest them into a container or cut them with a sickle. Moses addressed divorce and remarriage, limiting a former husband's ability to reclaim a woman after she had married someone else. A newly married man was exempt from military and public duty for a year so he could remain with his wife. A millstone could not be taken as security for debt because it represented a household's means of preparing food. Kidnapping an Israelite for enslavement was a capital crime. Skin disease had to be handled according to priestly instruction, with Miriam's punishment remembered as a warning. Lenders could not enter a borrower's home to seize a pledge. They had to wait outside for it to be brought. A poor person's cloak had to be returned by sunset. Hired workers were to be paid each day before the need became desperation. Parents were not executed for their children, nor children for their parents. Each person answered for personal wrongdoing. Justice for foreigners, orphans, and widows could not be distorted. A widow's clothing was not to be taken as security. Harvesters who forgot a sheaf in the field had to leave it. Olives were beaten once, and vineyards gathered once. What remained belonged to the vulnerable. In disputes, judges could order corporal punishment proportionate to the offense, but the number of blows was limited, so punishment did not erase the offender's dignity. An ox was not to be muzzled while treading grain. Family obligation included preserving the line of a brother who died without a son. If the surviving brother refused, the widow could bring the matter publicly before the elders. Dishonest weights and measures were forbidden. Trade had to reflect the same truth demanded in court, and Israel was commanded to remember Amalek, who had attacked the weary and vulnerable during the journey. When Israel had rest in the land, Amalek's name was to be removed. Moses brought the exposition to its final household acts. After entering the land, an Israelite would place the first produce of the soil in a basket and bring it to the sanctuary. There, the worshipper would recite the family story. An ancestor who wandered, descent into Egypt, growth into a nation, oppression, a cry for help, deliverance through signs, and arrival in a fertile land. The first fruits turned personal harvest into evidence that the old promise had reached a household. In the third-year tithe, the giver declared that the sacred portion had been distributed to Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows, according to the command. Then Moses and the elders called Israel to careful obedience. That day, Israel affirmed that the Lord was their God, and that they would walk in his ways. And the Lord affirmed Israel as his treasured people, called to keep the commands and to be set apart among the nations. The terms for life in the land had been spoken. Now Israel had to stand publicly beneath the blessing and the curse those terms carried. Moses and the elders commanded the people to prepare for a ceremony after crossing the Jordan. Large stones were to be set up, covered with plaster and inscribed with the words of the law. On Mount Ebal, Israel would build an altar from stones untouched by iron tools. Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings would be presented there, and the people would eat and rejoice before God. The law was not to remain only in Moses' voice. It would stand written inside the land. Moses and the priests called for Israel's attention. The people had become the covenant nation of the Lord their God. They were to listen and obey. 6 tribes would stand on Mount Gerizim to pronounce blessing: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. The other 6 would stand on Mount Ebal for the curse: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites would speak, and the entire nation would answer. A curse was pronounced upon anyone who secretly made and worshipped an idol. The people answered, Amen. The same answer followed curses against dishonoring parents, moving a neighbor's boundary marker, misleading the blind, and denying justice to a foreigner, orphan, or widow. Forbidden sexual relationships were named, so were secret murder, payment for killing the innocent, and refusal to uphold the words of the law. Each time Israel answered that the judgment was just. Moses then set out the blessing attached to faithful obedience. Israel would be blessed in city and countryside. Children, crops, and livestock would flourish. Baskets and kneading bowls would be full. The people would be blessed when they entered and when they went out. Enemies attacking from one direction would flee in many directions. Work would prosper, storehouses would be filled, and rain would come in season. Other nations would recognize Israel as a people set apart. Israel would lend rather than borrow and become the head rather than the tail. But the blessing depended upon remaining on the commanded path. Turning toward other gods would reverse it. The curses began as the mirror image of the blessings. City and field would suffer. Crops, herds, flocks, households and work would fail. Disease, fever, drought, blight and confusion would follow. The sky would become like bronze and the ground like iron. Rain would turn to dust. Israel would march against an enemy and flee. The defeat would become a horror to surrounding kingdoms. The warnings moved from loss into humiliation. A man could become engaged and lose the woman to another. He could build a house and never live in it, plant a vineyard and never enjoy its fruit. Livestock would be taken. Sons and daughters would be carried away while their parents watched helplessly. Foreign powers would consume the produce of Israel's labor. Oppression would drive the people into madness. Physical affliction would spread from head to foot. A king appointed over Israel would be led into exile, and the nation would serve gods made of wood and stone. The foreign resident would rise while the Israelite declined. Israel would borrow rather than lend and become the tail rather than the head. Moses made clear that covenant collapse would not remain a limited setback. The curses would pursue the nation because abundance had not produced grateful service. A distant nation would come swiftly, speaking a language Israel did not understand. It would show no respect for the old or mercy toward the young. The invader would consume grain, wine, oil, livestock, and every resource until fortified walls fell. Siege would reduce the people to conditions beyond ordinary hunger. Parents who had lived with tenderness and refinement would turn against their own households and consume their children in secret because nothing else remained. The nation once compared to the stars would be left few in number. Just as Israel had been blessed and multiplied, so the people would be uprooted from the land. They would be scattered among nations and live without security. Lives would hang in suspense, with fear by day and night. Moses carried the final warning back toward Egypt. The people delivered from slavery would be taken toward Egypt again, offering themselves for sale, yet finding no one willing to buy them. The story could return to its beginning in reverse: inheritance lost, freedom undone, and the nation that came out by a mighty hand scattered beneath foreign power. These were the terms of the covenant renewed in Moab, in addition to the covenant made at Horeb. Moses summoned the people and reminded them that they had seen what happened to Pharaoh, his officials, and his land. They had witnessed the signs and wonders. Yet seeing an event did not guarantee understanding it. The wilderness generation had watched miracle after miracle and still refused the land. For 40 years, Israel's clothing had not worn out, and sandals had not failed. The people had not lived on ordinary bread and wine. Their dependence had taught them who sustained them. Then Sihon and Og had attacked, and their kingdoms had fallen. Their lands now belonged to Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Israel must therefore keep the covenant and act with care. Everyone stood within it: tribal leaders, elders, officials, men, children, wives, and foreigners living in the camp, including those who cut wood and carried water. The covenant embraced the present assembly and the generations represented through them. No individual, family, or tribe could hear the warning and quietly decide that it did not apply. Moses described such a person as a root-producing poison, someone who heard the oath, but reassured himself that he would remain safe while following a stubborn heart. Private rebellion could bring public ruin. Future generations and foreign visitors would see the consequences. They would look upon a land burned with sulfur and salt, unable to produce, and ask why the Lord had done this. The answer would be that Israel abandoned the covenant of the God who brought the people out of Egypt. They served gods they had not known, and the nation was uprooted and cast into another land. Some things remained hidden with God, but what had been revealed belonged to Israel and its children so they could obey.
And remember,
Then the speech turned again.
hope awaits us.
Judgment and exile did not have to become the final word. When all these blessings and curses had come, and Israel remembered the covenant among the nations, the people could return. If they turned back with their children and obeyed with the whole heart and life, God would restore them. Even if the exiles had been driven to the farthest horizon, they would be gathered. Israel would be brought again into the land of its ancestors.
Hold the pole tight.
The nation would be restored and multiplied. God would circumcise the hearts of the people and their descendants so they could love him and live. The curses would fall upon the enemies who persecuted them. Israel would again obey. Work, children, livestock, and crops would prosper. Moses did not present restoration as permission to rebel. He returned the choice to the people standing before him. The command was not too difficult or too distant. It was not hidden in heaven so that someone had to ascend and retrieve it. It did not lie beyond the sea so that someone had to cross and bring it back. The word was near them, in their mouths and hearts, so they could do it. Moses placed two futures before Israel: life and good, death and disaster. To love God, walk in his ways, and keep the commands led toward life, increase and blessing in the land. Turning away, refusing to listen, and bowing to other gods led toward destruction. The people would not remain long in the country they were crossing the Jordan to possess. He called heaven and earth as witnesses. Life and death stood before them. Blessing and curse stood before them. Then Moses urged Israel to choose life so they and their children could live. They were to love the Lord their God, listen to his voice and hold fast to him, because he was their life and the one who would sustain them in the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses had taken the people as far as words could take them. The choice had been spoken. Now he had to prepare Israel to hear those words after his own voice was gone. Moses went before the people and told them that he was now 120 years old. He would no longer lead Israel in going out and coming in, and the Lord had told him that he would not cross the Jordan, but Israel would cross. God would go ahead of the people and destroy the nations occupying the land. Joshua would lead them, and the kingdoms west of the river would fall as Sihon and Og had fallen in the east. The people were to be strong and courageous. They must not panic before their enemies, because God would go with them and would neither leave nor abandon them. Then Moses called Joshua forward in the sight of Israel. He gave the same charge directly to him. Joshua had to be strong and courageous because he would enter the land with the people and divide it among them as their inheritance. The task did not depend upon Moses remaining alive. God would go before Joshua and remain with him. Joshua was not to fear or lose heart. Moses wrote down the law and gave it to the priests who carried the ark, as well as to Israel's elders. Every seventh year, during the Feast of Shelters, the law was to be read publicly at the chosen place. Men, women, children, and foreign residents would gather to hear it. Those who already knew the covenant would learn again to fear and obey. Children who had not witnessed the wilderness journey would hear the words and learn them before living in the land. The nation would not be governed by a memory of Moses' personality. The written covenant would be read aloud to each generation. Then Moses and Joshua were summoned to the tent of meeting. The pillar of cloud stood at its entrance, and God told Moses that his death was near. Israel's future rebellion was disclosed before the crossing. After entering the land and eating its abundance, the people would turn toward foreign gods and break the covenant. Disasters would follow, and Israel would ask whether these evils had come because God was no longer among them. Moses was therefore commanded to write a song and teach it to Israel. The song would remain in the people's mouths as a witness. When later generations suffered the consequences of rebellion, they would still possess words explaining what had happened. God commissioned Joshua again. He was to be strong and courageous because he would bring Israel into the promised land and God would remain with him. Moses finished writing the law from beginning to end. He commanded the Levites who carried the ark to place the book beside it as a witness against Israel. He spoke plainly about what experience had taught him. The people had been rebellious and stubborn while he was alive among them. Their resistance would not disappear after his death. Moses called the elders and officials to assemble. He wanted the words delivered in their hearing because he knew that after his death, Israel would corrupt itself and turn from the commanded path. Then Moses spoke the song before the entire assembly. He called heaven and earth to listen. He wanted his teaching to fall like rain upon grass, giving life rather than disappearing as an empty sound. He proclaimed the name of the Lord and described God as the rock, whose work was perfect and whose ways were just. God was faithful and upright. Against that faithfulness, the song placed Israel's corruption. The people had acted as a crooked generation toward the one who made and established them. Moses told Israel to remember ancient days and ask their parents and elders. When the nations received their places, Israel had been given a distinct inheritance. God had found the people in a desert land and guarded them as the center of his care. Like an eagle stirring its nest and spreading its wings beneath its young, he had carried them. No foreign god had accomplished that rescue. Israel had been led upon the heights and fed from the produce of the land with honey, oil, grain, wine, milk, and the best of the flocks and herds. But abundance would bring danger. The nation, called Jeshurun in the song, would grow satisfied and reject the God who made it. Israel would provoke him with foreign gods and offer sacrifices to powers that had not delivered them. They would forget the rock who gave them life. The song described the response. God would hide his face and allow the people to see the outcome of their faithlessness. They had provoked him with what was not truly God. They would be provoked by those they regarded as no people. Fire, famine, disease, wild animals, violence, and terror would fall. Young and old would suffer, both inside homes and outside them. Israel could have been scattered beyond memory, but the nations might misunderstand the victory. Enemies could claim that their own strength had defeated Israel. The song therefore turned against those enemies as well. Their power was not the rock of Israel. Their corruption carried its own appointed judgment. When Israel's strength was gone and no human power remained, God would judge his people and show compassion. The false gods in which they trusted would be unable to rise and help. They had not given life, and they could not rescue from death. The Lord alone killed and made alive, wounded and healed. No one could deliver from his hand. Vengeance against Israel's enemies was reserved for the appointed time. Their day would come, just as Israel's rebellion had brought its own consequence. The song ended by calling the nations to rejoice with Israel, because the blood of God's servants would be avenged and atonement made for the land and people. Moses recited these words with Joshua beside him. When the song was finished, Moses told Israel to take every word to heart and command their children to obey the law. These were not empty words. They were Israel's life, and by them the people would live long in the land across the Jordan. That same day, Moses was told to climb the Abarim range to Mount Nebo and view Canaan. He would die upon the mountain and be gathered to his people as Aaron had died on Mount Hor. The reason was stated again. At the waters of Meribah, Moses and Aaron had broken faith and failed to uphold God's holiness before Israel. Moses would see the land from a distance, but he would not enter. Before climbing the mountain, he blessed the tribes. The blessing opened with the appearance of God from Sinai, coming in majesty with the law for Israel. The people had received an inheritance not merely of land, but of covenant instruction, with God recognized as king among the assembled tribes. Moses asked that Reuben live and not disappear, though its numbers were small. For Judah, he asked that the tribe's cry be heard and that help come against its enemies. Levi's blessing reflected the tribe's sacred responsibility. The Levites had guarded the covenant through severe tests. They would teach the law to Israel, present incense, and place offerings upon the altar. Moses asked for their strength and protection against those who opposed them. Benjamin was described as secure, dwelling under divine protection. Joseph received a long blessing of fruitfulness, dew, deep waters, sun-ripened crops, ancient mountains, and the richness of the earth. The strength of Joseph's tribes was pictured like the horns of a wild ox, with Ephraim and Manasseh pushing against nations. Zebulun was blessed in its ventures, and Issachar in its tents. Together they would draw abundance from sea and sand. Gad was praised for choosing territory east of the Jordan, while still carrying out justice and joining Israel's leaders in battle. Dan was compared to a young lion. Naphtali would be satisfied with favor and inherit toward the lake and south. Asher would be blessed among the tribes, with oil, secure gates, and strength sufficient for each day. Moses closed by declaring that no one was like the God of Israel, who rode across the heavens to help the people. The eternal God was their refuge, and everlasting arms held them. Enemies would be driven out, and Israel would dwell securely in a land of grain and wine beneath rain-filled skies. The people Moses blessed were unlike any other nation. They had been saved by the Lord, their shield and sword. When the blessing ended, Moses left the plains of Moab. He climbed Mount Nebo alone and reached the summit of Pisgah, across from Jericho. From there, God showed him the land. Moses saw north toward Gilead and Dan. He saw the territories of Naphtali, Ephraim, and Manasseh. He looked over Judah toward the Mediterranean Sea. He saw the Negev in the south and the valley stretching from Jericho, the city of palms, toward Zoar. This was the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land their descendants would receive. Moses had first heard of it at the burning bush, when he stood as a fugitive shepherd, with no authority, no army, and no certainty that Israel would listen to him. Now the nation was gathered below him, counted, armed, instructed, and waiting to cross. God told Moses that the land had been shown to his own eyes, but he would not pass into it. There, in the land of Moab, Moses died. He was 120 years old. His eyesight had not failed, and his physical strength had not left him. His life did not end because he lacked the power to take another step. It ended at the boundary God had set. He was buried in a valley in Moab, opposite Beth Peor. No human being knew the location of his grave. The Israelites mourned for Moses on the plains of Moab for 30 days. The nation stopped at the edge of the Jordan and observed the full period of grief. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him. The Israelites listened to Joshua and followed the command given through Moses. Yet the record did not treat succession as replacement. No prophet had arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. No other leader had been sent to perform such signs against Pharaoh and Egypt, or to display such mighty power before all Israel. The child drawn from the Nile had outlived the king who sought his death. He had returned to Egypt, broken Pharaoh's hold, carried an enslaved people through the sea, stood with them beneath Sinai, and remained between them and destruction through 40 years of rebellion. He had reached the promised land exactly as far as the judgment allowed. The 30 days of mourning ended. Moses remained somewhere in an unknown grave east of the Jordan. Joshua stood among the living with Moses' law, Moses' commission, and the river still in front of him. After Moses' death, the Lord spoke to Joshua. "Moses, my servant, is dead." The period of waiting was over. Joshua was commanded to rise, take the entire nation across the Jordan, and enter the land being given to Israel. Every place their feet touched would belong to them within the promised boundaries. From the wilderness in the south toward Lebanon, from the Euphrates and the land of the Hittites to the Mediterranean Sea. No enemy would be able to stand before Joshua throughout his life. The promise given to him was personal and direct. As God had been with Moses, so he would be with Joshua. He would not leave or abandon him. Joshua was to be strong and courageous. He would lead the people into their inheritance. But courage in battle was not enough. Joshua had to remain governed by the law Moses had given him. He was not to turn from it to the right or left. Its words were to remain in his mouth and occupy his thought day and night, so that his actions stayed within what had been commanded. Again came the charge. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or discouraged, because the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Joshua stood east of the Jordan, with Israel behind him, the promised land beyond the water, and Moses' final task now resting upon him. The river remained before them. The command was to rise and cross.